Welcome to Thunga Story Time. Today, we're diving into the hidden world beneath our feet, ancient roads that shaped empires, fueled wars, sparked trade, and spread ideas across continents. Imagine traveling on paths built thousands of years ago, where mighty armies marched, traders exchanged exotic goods, and cultures collided. From the legendary Roman highways to the incredible Incan rope bridges high in the Andes, these roads are the secret veins of history. Join me as we uncover the incredible stories, engineering marvels, and lasting legacies of these forgotten highways that still influence our lives today. Ready to step back in time? Let's go. The significance of ancient roads, more than just pathways. When we think about roads today, we often imagine highways, streets, or simple routes connecting one place to another. They're essential for daily commuting, transporting goods, and linking cities and towns. However, in the ancient world, roads were far more than mere paths from point A to point B. They were monumental achievements that symbolized the strength, power, and organizational capabilities of entire civilizations. Ancient roads functioned as the lifelines of empires, acting as critical arteries through which military forces, merchants, messengers, and pilgrims traveled. These networks connected far-flung territories, allowing rulers to maintain control and oversee vast regions efficiently. Roads were a tool of governance, a means to consolidate power and influence over diverse peoples and landscapes. One of the fundamental roles of these roads was military. The ability to move armies quickly and efficiently could determine the survival or collapse of a state. Roads facilitated rapid troop deployments, ensured supply lines remained intact, and enabled communication between distant outposts and the capital. Empires like Rome invested heavily in their road networks precisely for these strategic purposes. Without reliable roads, it would have been nearly impossible to maintain order and project military power over large distances. Trade was another vital function served by ancient roads. Commercial caravans traversed these routes carrying spices, metals, textiles, and other valuable goods. Roads connected markets from different regions, stimulating economic activity and cultural exchange. Merchants depended on well-maintained routes to move their goods safely and quickly, while taxes and tolls collected along the way enriched the state treasury. Roads became the veins through which wealth and resources flowed, shaping the economic landscape of ancient civilizations. Beyond military and trade uses, roads also played a significant role in spreading ideas, religions, and culture. They were conduits for missionaries, scholars, and travelers who carried philosophies, art, and new customs from one region to another. The Silk Road is a famous example. Its routes enabled Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and many other belief systems to spread across continents. Roads facilitated dialogue between distant peoples and fostered a shared cultural heritage. Furthermore, roads represented political power and control. Building and maintaining an extensive road system required substantial resources and labor. It demonstrated a ruler's ability to mobilize the population and project authority across large territories. Roads often linked administrative centers, military forts, and economic hubs, reinforcing the governance structure of the empire. In some cases, rulers would inscribe milestones or erect monuments along roads to display their achievements and remind travelers of the central authority's presence. The very design and construction of roads also reflected the technological and engineering expertise of ancient civilizations. From simple dirt tracks to multi-layered paved highways, these roads were built to last and endure harsh environmental conditions. They incorporated innovations such as drainage systems to prevent flooding, stone bridges to cross rivers, and way stations for travelers to rest. The sophistication of road construction symbolized the advancement and ingenuity of the society that built them. In summary, ancient roads were far more than functional pathways. They were powerful symbols of empire, tools for governance and control, facilitators of commerce and cultural exchange, and impressive feats of engineering. They connected people, places, and ideas, shaping the course of human history in profound ways. When we walk on modern roads, we follow in the footsteps of those ancient travelers whose journeys paved the way for the interconnected world we live in today. The earliest paths, foundations of civilization's networks. Following the profound significance of ancient roads as symbols of power, commerce, and cultural exchange, it is important to step back in time and explore the very beginnings of these pathways, those earliest routes carved out by human hands and feet. Long before grand imperial highways were paved in stone, before royal courier systems buzzed with activity, there were humble beginnings, simple paths etched into the earth by the movement of people, animals, and carts. Some of the earliest known roads trace their origins to Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, where humans first transitioned from nomadic lifestyles to settled agricultural communities. Here, in the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, small dirt tracks emerged as practical solutions to everyday challenges. These trails, made by repeated foot traffic and the wheels of primitive carts, connected villages, farmlands, and trading spots. Though rudimentary, these paths were indispensable, laying the literal and figurative groundwork for the complex networks that empires would develop centuries later. These early Mesopotamian roads were not paved or engineered with layers of stone, but their role was crucial. They made travel more predictable and safer, preventing travelers from getting lost in vast wilderness and facilitating the movement of food, goods, and information. As communities grew larger and trade became more important, these paths naturally evolved, widened by more use, occasionally reinforced with crushed gravel or mud to improve durability. What's fascinating is that these simple roads represented humanity's first collective effort to reshape the natural landscape for social benefit. Rather than settling for scattered, isolated communities, early humans began to envision connections, links that would bind people together for mutual advantage. This concept would become the cornerstone for all later infrastructure projects across the world. Beyond Mesopotamia, other early cultures developed similar paths in their own ways. In the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished around the same time, city planners incorporated straight streets and pathways that organized urban life. In ancient Egypt, paths along the Nile helped coordinate travel and trade between farming villages, religious centers, and the capital. While these earliest roads were humble, their impact was profound. They allowed for the rise of trade networks that stretched beyond local communities to distant regions. Caravans could move goods such as grains, textiles, pottery, and metals, fueling economic growth and cultural diffusion. This was the beginning of an interconnected world where ideas, technologies, and beliefs could spread more easily. Importantly, these paths also facilitated early forms of governance. Rulers recognized that controlling movement across their lands meant controlling people and resources. As a result, they began to invest in improving roads, setting standards for maintenance, and establishing checkpoints or guard posts to monitor traffic and collect tolls or taxes. Thus, the road was not just a physical object but a mechanism of authority and statecraft. Moreover, the humble origins of these early paths highlight the remarkable ingenuity of human societies. With limited tools and knowledge, ancient peoples adapted their environment to suit complex social needs. They learned how to choose routes that avoided natural obstacles like swamps and steep hills, and how to maintain roads during different seasons. These practices were passed down, refined, and eventually incorporated into the grand road-building traditions of empires like Persia and Rome. In essence, the earliest paths in Mesopotamia and other ancient regions served as a foundation for the dramatic evolution of road systems. From these dirt trails, the concept of a road transformed into a powerful symbol of civilization itself, representing order, connectivity, and progress. They remind us that even the grandest empires and most sophisticated networks started with simple steps, taken one after another by countless individuals over generations. Today, when we travel on modern highways, it's easy to overlook the origins of these routes. Yet beneath the asphalt and concrete lies the legacy of those earliest pathways, silent witnesses to human ambition and cooperation. Understanding the story of these first roads helps us appreciate how far we've come and how deeply our societies are shaped by the desire to connect and communicate. The Persian Royal Road, the empire's lifeline. Building upon the foundation of simple dirt paths and local trails, the Persian Empire took road construction to an unprecedented level. Among the earliest and most impressive grand road systems in history was the Persian Royal Road, an engineering marvel and political tool that stretched across vast and diverse terrains, connecting distant corners of one of the largest empires of the ancient world. The Royal Road ran approximately 1,500 miles, about 2,400 kilometers, from Sardis, located in what is now western Turkey, all the way to Susa, a major city in modern-day Iran. This extensive network was not just a path carved into the earth, it was a carefully planned infrastructure project designed to facilitate rapid communication, military movement, economic exchange, and administrative control. What made the Persian Royal Road revolutionary was the system of rest stations placed at regular intervals along its length. These stations, known as caravanserais, provided fresh horses, food, shelter, and supplies for travelers and couriers. The royal messengers, or angaria, used this relay system to pass messages quickly across the empire. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, famously remarked that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, a phrase that echoes the reliability and speed of the Persian postal system. This courier network allowed messages and decrees from the Persian king to travel thousands of miles in just a few days, a staggering improvement over previous communication methods. The ability to communicate quickly across great distances was crucial for governing such a sprawling empire, which spanned multiple cultures, languages, and geographic challenges. The Royal Road also supported military logistics. Armies could be mobilized rapidly, moving soldiers, weapons, and supplies efficiently along a secure and maintained route. This capability helped Persia maintain control over its territories and respond swiftly to rebellions or external threats. Moreover, the road facilitated trade throughout the empire. Merchants used the route to transport goods such as textiles, spices, metals, and agricultural products. The road helped integrate the diverse economies within the Persian Empire, boosting prosperity and encouraging cultural exchange between East and West. The construction of the Royal Road demonstrated impressive engineering skills for its time. Builders had to overcome natural obstacles like rivers, mountains, and deserts. Stone bridges span waterways, and sections of the road were paved with gravel or stone to improve durability and usability throughout the year. Administratively, the road symbolized the power and reach of the Persian kings. Milestones marked distances, and guards monitored travelers to ensure safety and security. The maintenance of the road required organization and resources, highlighting the empire's ability to mobilize labor and manage complex projects on a large scale. The legacy of the Persian Royal Road extends beyond its physical structure. It set a precedent for future empires, including the Romans, who borrowed and expanded upon Persian road-building concepts. The idea of connecting an empire through a vast, well-maintained road network became a model of imperial governance and infrastructure development. Today, the traces of the Royal Road remind us of a time when connectivity was a matter of survival and power. It was an artery that pumped information, commerce, and culture across ancient lands, knitting together diverse peoples under the banner of empire. The road's existence transformed the way societies communicated and interacted, making it one of the earliest examples of a truly interconnected civilization. In essence, the Persian Royal Road was more than just a route. It was a symbol of unity, efficiency, and imperial ambition. It showcased how infrastructure could be leveraged as a political and military tool, shaping history in profound ways. Roman roads, the gold standard of ancient engineering. Following the impressive example set by the Persian Royal Road, the Romans took the concept of road building to an extraordinary new level. The Roman road system became the gold standard for infrastructure in the ancient world, an immense, meticulously planned network spanning over 50,000 miles, more than 80,000 kilometers, across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. It was arguably one of the most sophisticated and enduring achievements of the Roman Empire, laying the foundation for many modern transportation routes still in use today. Roman roads were far more than simple pathways. They were engineering masterpieces designed for durability, efficiency, and strategic advantage. The construction techniques employed by Roman engineers were advanced for their time and remarkably consistent throughout the empire. Roads were built with multiple carefully layered materials, a foundation of large stones, a middle layer of gravel mixed with sand or lime, and a top layer of tightly fitted paving stones. This multi-layered approach ensured the roads were strong, well-drained, and capable of withstanding heavy traffic and harsh weather conditions. One of the most distinctive features of Roman roads was their famous straightness. Roman surveyors used sophisticated tools and methods to plot roads that followed the most direct routes possible, regardless of natural obstacles. They cut through hills, built bridges over rivers, and constructed tunnels through mountains when necessary. This directness not only shortened travel times but also projected Roman authority and order across the landscape. Roman roads were indispensable to the empire's military machine. The ability to rapidly deploy troops, supplies, and communications was essential to controlling vast territories and defending against invasions or rebellions. Roads allowed legions to march swiftly to the empire's frontiers, reinforcing positions or launching campaigns. Along the roads, the Romans established a network of forts, watchtowers, and way stations to support military logistics and maintain security. But Roman roads were not solely for military purposes. They also played a vital role in economic life by facilitating trade and commerce. Markets and towns flourished along these routes, where merchants exchanged goods such as olive oil, wine, metals, ceramics, and textiles. The roads connected rural agricultural areas with urban centers, enabling efficient transport of food and raw materials. Toll stations and customs posts along the roads provided revenue for the empire, reinforcing the state's financial power. In addition, Roman roads were essential to governance and administration. The empire's vast bureaucracy depended on the reliable movement of officials, tax collectors, judges, and messengers. Couriers carried imperial edicts and legal documents across provinces, ensuring uniform rule and communication. Roads thus underpinned the Roman legal and political system, linking the emperor's capital with distant territories. Perhaps equally important was the role Roman roads played in spreading Roman culture and civilization. Through these routes, Roman law, language, architecture, and customs disseminated across conquered lands, helping to unify a diverse empire of many peoples. Roads connected cultural centers, theaters, temples, and forums, facilitating festivals, religious pilgrimages, and social gatherings that reinforced shared identities. The legacy of Roman roads is undeniable. Many modern European highways and streets trace their origins back to these ancient routes. Cities like London, Paris, and Rome itself were built around and grew because of their connections to this extensive network. The phrase "all roads lead to Rome" captures the central role these roads played in connecting the ancient world. Technically, the Romans also innovated features such as milestones, stone markers indicating distances and directions, that improved navigation and administration. Drainage ditches and curbs helped keep roads dry and safe. Roadside inns and mansiones provided rest for travelers and official couriers. These infrastructure elements reflected a comprehensive approach to road building and maintenance, unmatched by many civilizations for centuries. The construction and upkeep of Roman roads required substantial state resources and organization. Legions often participated in road building, alongside skilled laborers and engineers. This massive undertaking symbolized the empire's strength and unity, illustrating how infrastructure was a key pillar of Roman power. In conclusion, Roman roads set the highest standard for road construction in the ancient world, combining engineering excellence with strategic military, economic, and cultural functions. They shaped the Roman Empire's expansion and administration while leaving a lasting imprint on the infrastructure and urban development of Europe and beyond. Walking on or driving along roads built on ancient Roman foundations is to connect with a legacy of human ingenuity that continues to influence our world today. The Inca road system, Capac Ñan, engineering marvels of the Andes. After exploring the monumental road systems of the Persians and Romans, we now journey across the ocean and high into the rugged Andes Mountains, where the Inca Empire constructed one of the most remarkable pre-modern transportation networks in human history. Known as the Capac Ñan, the Inca road system stretched over 25,000 miles, approximately 40,000 kilometers, connecting the vast and diverse terrains of South America, from arid deserts and dense forests to the soaring peaks and deep valleys of the Andes. Unlike the wide stone-paved highways of Rome or the flat desert routes of Persia, the Inca roads were uniquely adapted to some of the most challenging landscapes on Earth. Built entirely by hand, without the aid of wheeled vehicles or draft animals, the Capac Ñan was a testament to human ingenuity and determination. It wove through steep mountain slopes, crossed turbulent rivers, and threaded across high-altitude plateaus, demonstrating a deep understanding of terrain and engineering. The construction techniques of the Inca were extraordinary. Paths were often paved with carefully fitted stones, laid in patterns that ensure durability and drainage. In areas with loose soil or unstable ground, retaining walls were built to stabilize the route. The Incas developed impressive solutions for crossing deep canyons and rivers, most famously, their suspension bridges made from braided grass ropes, some spanning hundreds of feet. These bridges required constant maintenance and community cooperation to remain safe and functional, symbolizing social organization and shared responsibility. Integral to the road system was the Chayski messenger service, a relay network of highly trained runners who could transmit messages and goods across great distances at astonishing speeds. Stations spaced roughly every few miles, called tambos, provided fresh runners with food, rest, and new supplies, allowing them to maintain a rapid pace. This relay system was essential for communication and administration, enabling the Sapa Inca, the emperor, and his officials to govern an empire that stretched from modern-day Colombia in the north to Chile and Argentina in the south. The efficiency of the Chayski runners was legendary. By handing off messages at these relay points, important news, military orders, and information about resources could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, a critical advantage in a rugged and expansive empire. The Inca road system thus functioned as a vital nervous system, keeping the empire connected and responsive despite its geographical challenges. Beyond military and administrative use, the Capac Ñan also supported trade and cultural exchange between diverse Andean communities. It linked agricultural zones producing potatoes, maize, quinoa, and coca leaves with marketplaces and religious centers. The roads were pilgrimage routes, facilitating spiritual journeys to sacred mountains and shrines. They also served to unify the empire culturally, physically binding together a mosaic of languages, ethnicities, and traditions under Inca rule. The road network exemplified the Inca worldview, one that valued harmony with nature and practical ingenuity. Every section of the Capac Ñan was designed to fit its environment rather than impose upon it, reflecting an approach to engineering that was sustainable and integrated with the landscape. This contrasts with many imperial road systems that sought to dominate the environment through brute force. The Inca road system's legacy is profound. Though much of it was disrupted or destroyed during and after the Spanish conquest, significant portions remain preserved and in use today. Modern highways and hiking trails often follow the original routes, testifying to the road builders' skill and foresight. The Capac Ñan stands as one of the greatest engineering achievements of the pre-Columbian Americas. It reveals how a civilization without horses, wheels, or iron tools managed to create an extensive, highly functional infrastructure that served military, administrative, economic, and cultural needs. It challenges modern assumptions about technological progress and highlights the diverse ways human societies have solved complex problems. In sum, the Inca road system is a remarkable chapter in the story of ancient roads, a testament to the power of human collaboration, adaptation, and resilience in the face of nature's challenges. It invites us to appreciate the sophisticated knowledge and social organization that enabled the Incas to connect their vast empire across one of the most formidable landscapes on Earth. Han Dynasty roads, connecting the Middle Kingdom and beyond. Continuing our journey through the world's great ancient road systems, we now turn to the Han Dynasty in China, one of the most influential empires in East Asian history. During the Han period, 206 BCE to 220 CE, the Chinese built and expanded an extensive road network that connected sprawling territories and played a crucial role in the flourishing of the Silk Road trade routes. This system was instrumental in facilitating military operations, governance, trade, and cultural exchange across vast distances. The Han roads were more than just simple paths, they were integral arteries supporting the empire's administration and expansion. As the Han Dynasty solidified its power, it recognized the need for efficient transportation infrastructure to unite its diverse and far-flung provinces. Roads linked major cities, military garrisons, agricultural regions, and trading hubs, creating a cohesive network that could support the empire's growing complexity. Central to the Han road system was the development of a sophisticated postal relay network known as the Yichuan. This system consisted of relay stations placed at regular intervals along the roads, staffed by couriers and officials responsible for maintaining rapid communication. The Yichuan network was designed to transmit official documents, military orders, and news quickly from the capital to the provinces and vice versa. Much like the Persian Angaria and Inca Chasqui systems, the Yichuan couriers used a relay method to cover large distances swiftly. At each station, a fresh messenger or horse would take over, enabling messages to travel hundreds of miles in a fraction of the time it would take a single rider. This innovation was essential for managing the empire's affairs efficiently, especially during times of war or rebellion. The Han roads were also vital in supporting military campaigns. The empire faced frequent threats along its borders, including nomadic tribes from the north and west. Rapid troop movement along well-maintained roads allowed the Han armies to defend, expand, and consolidate territory. Fortified way stations provided supplies and shelter for soldiers on the march, ensuring readiness and endurance. Economic activity flourished along the Han roads as well. These routes facilitated the transportation of silk, tea, spices, metals, and other valuable commodities between the interior and frontier regions. Importantly, the road network linked to the famous Silk Road, the transcontinental trade route that connected China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. By improving access to trade centers, the Han roads helped China become a global economic powerhouse of its time. The Han roads were engineered with care and sophistication. Builders constructed raised causeways to traverse marshy or flood-prone areas and stone-paved sections in high-traffic zones. Drainage ditches alongside the roads prevented erosion and maintained their usability through the seasons. The network also included bridges and tunnels to overcome natural obstacles, enabling year-round connectivity. Along the roads, milestones and signposts provided travelers with crucial information on distances and directions. Inns and rest stops offered shelter and provisions, fostering a culture of travel and commerce. The road system's maintenance was a state priority, demonstrating the importance the Han court placed on infrastructure as a pillar of imperial power. Culturally, the Han roads facilitated the exchange of ideas, philosophies, and religions. Buddhist missionaries and scholars traveled these routes, spreading their teachings westward, while Confucian ideals and Chinese inventions moved along the Silk Road. The roads thus became conduits not only for goods but also for the flow of knowledge and cultural diffusion. The legacy of the Han road network is far-reaching. It laid the foundation for future Chinese dynasties' infrastructure projects and helped integrate China's vast and varied geography into a cohesive empire. The emphasis on connectivity and communication reflected a sophisticated understanding of statecraft and governance. Today, archaeological remains of Han roads, relay stations, and milestones offer invaluable insights into ancient Chinese engineering and administration. They remind us that the Han dynasty's success was not only due to military conquests or political reforms but also to their ability to build and maintain the physical networks that connected their world. In summary, the Han dynasty's road and relay system was a critical element in the empire's rise and sustainability. It showcased advanced engineering, strategic planning, and administrative innovation. Like the great roads of Persia, Rome, the Incas, and others, the Han road shaped the political, economic, and cultural landscapes of their time, and continued to inspire modern infrastructure development. Ancient Greek roads, connecting cities, states, and culture. As we traverse the vast history of ancient road systems, we arrive in the world of the Greeks, a civilization renowned for its philosophy, art, and political innovation. Unlike the imperial empires of Persia, Rome, or the Han Dynasty. Ancient Greece was a patchwork of independent city-states, polis, each with its own governance and priorities. This fragmented political landscape influenced the nature and function of Greek roads, which were primarily built to meet local needs rather than imperial ambitions. Greek roads served as vital connectors between neighboring city-states, agricultural villages, markets, and places of worship. While these roads lacked the vast scale or monumental engineering feats of the Romans or Incas, they were essential in supporting the social, economic, and religious life of the Greek world. Their role was to facilitate everyday travel, trade, and communication within a landscape shaped by mountains, seas, and valleys. One of the most famous routes was the Sacred Way, which linked Athens to the sanctuary of Eleusis, home of the Eleusinian Mysteries, a series of secret religious rites and festivals dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. Each year, thousands of pilgrims traveled this road during the sacred festivals, moving solemnly through the countryside in a ritual procession. The Sacred Way was more than just a path, it was a symbolic journey reflecting the spiritual beliefs and cultural identity of the Athenians. Beyond religious purposes, Greek roads enabled the movement of philosophers, soldiers, merchants, and citizens. Figures like Socrates and Plato likely traveled these roads as they visited various city-states to teach and debate ideas. Soldiers used these routes during wars such as the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, moving troops between allied cities or to contested regions. Greek roads often connected agora, marketplaces, which were the economic heart of city-states. These vibrant centers of trade relied on roads to bring in goods like olive oil, wine, pottery, and grain. Through these commercial links, Greek culture and influence spread across the Aegean and Mediterranean, reaching colonies and trading partners far from the mainland. While most Greek roads were modest dirt or gravel paths adapted to the terrain, some were paved or reinforced near cities or important sites. Road construction reflected local geography, with routes winding around hills, following river valleys, or hugging coastal cliffs. Stone markers or simple milestones occasionally guided travelers, but Greek roads generally prioritized practicality over grandeur. Greek engineers also built infrastructure such as bridges to span small rivers and aqueducts to supply cities with water, though large-scale road-building projects like those of the Romans were rare. The mountainous terrain of Greece often made long-distance travel difficult, encouraging a network of short connecting roads rather than a unified highway system. Despite their relatively local focus, Greek roads contributed to the cultural and political unity of the Hellenic world. They allowed citizens to participate in pan-Hellenic festivals such as the Olympic Games, held in Olympia, and religious events in Delphi. These roads were routes of exchange not only for goods but also for ideas, helping to shape the intellectual heritage of Western civilization. The Greek road network also played a role in the spread of Hellenistic culture after the conquests of Alexander the Great, as roads connected newly founded cities across a vast empire stretching from Greece to Egypt and into Asia. While much of this later road construction borrowed from Persian and Roman models, it built upon the tradition of connectivity established in the Greek mainland. Today, remnants of ancient Greek roads still exist, preserved near archaeological sites and within the roadways of modern Greece. Walking along these ancient paths offers a glimpse into the daily lives, spiritual journeys, and civic activities of the Greeks, reminding us how even modest roads can shape history. In essence, ancient Greek roads were the lifelines of a civilization that valued philosophy, democracy, and religious devotion. Though not as expansive or engineered for empire as others, these roads carried the footsteps of some of history's greatest thinkers, warriors, and pilgrims, linking city-states and nurturing a culture whose influence echoes through time. Ancient Indian roads, the Mauryan vision of connectivity and compassion. Our exploration of ancient road systems now brings us to the Indian subcontinent during the reign of one of its greatest emperors, Ashoka the Great, circa 268–232 BCE, of the Maurya Empire. Known not only for his military conquests but also for his profound commitment to peace and Buddhism, Ashoka's rule marked a transformative period in the development of infrastructure, governance, and spirituality. Central to his vision was the construction and enhancement of a network of roads that stretched across the vast and diverse territories of India, serving as vital arteries for commerce, pilgrimage, and cultural exchange. Unlike many ancient road systems primarily focused on military or administrative needs, the roads developed under Ashoka reflected a deeper humanitarian purpose. These routes were designed to facilitate the movement of people and goods while also promoting the emperor's ideals of welfare, compassion, and religious harmony. One of the defining features of Mauryan roads was their thoughtful design catering to travelers' comfort and safety. Many roads were lined with shady trees, providing relief from the intense Indian sun, an early form of roadside landscaping aimed at improving the travel experience. In a time when long-distance journeys could be arduous and perilous, these shaded avenues offered rest and respite, reflecting an enlightened concern for the well-being of subjects and visitors alike. Along these roads, travelers could find wells and water sources, ensuring access to clean drinking water, a crucial necessity in the often hot and dry climate of the subcontinent. The presence of such amenities demonstrated an advanced understanding of infrastructure's role in supporting daily life and commerce. Equally important were the inns or rest houses, places where merchants, pilgrims, and officials could pause during their journeys. These accommodations fostered not only physical rest but also social interaction, as travelers from various regions and backgrounds met, exchanged news, and shared ideas. Perhaps the most historically significant markers along Mauryan roads were the stone pillars inscribed with royal edicts, the famous Ashoka pillars. These monumental columns bore inscriptions in multiple languages and scripts, conveying the emperor's messages on moral governance, nonviolence, religious tolerance, and public welfare. Placed at strategic points along the roads, these pillars served as both practical signposts and profound instruments of ideological communication. The road network was crucial for trade, connecting cities, ports, and rural areas, enabling the movement of goods such as spices, textiles, precious stones, and metals. By improving connectivity, these routes helped integrate the economy of the Maurya Empire, fostering prosperity and cultural exchange within and beyond its borders. Moreover, the roads facilitated pilgrimage and religious dissemination, particularly the spread of Buddhism. Ashoka himself famously embraced Buddhism after witnessing the devastation of war, and he actively promoted its teachings. Roads allowed monks, pilgrims, and missionaries to travel to sacred sites like Bodh Gaya, the place of Buddha's enlightenment, and other important religious centers. This mobility played a critical role in Buddhism's expansion across the Indian subcontinent and into Central Asia. Technically, the Mauryan road system was a marvel of its time. Builders adapted to various terrains, from the fertile Gangetic plains to the rugged edges of the Himalayas. Roads were constructed with durable materials and drainage systems to withstand seasonal monsoon rains, ensuring year-round usability. The legacy of Ashoka's roads extends far beyond their physical structure. They symbolize a holistic approach to infrastructure, one that blends engineering, governance, social welfare, and spirituality. These roads were more than trade routes, they were conduits for ideas, compassion, and cultural unity. Today, archaeological remnants and ancient texts help historians reconstruct the scale and impact of these roads. The Ashoka pillars, some still standing, continue to inspire as symbols of ethical leadership and visionary statecraft. The roads themselves remind us that infrastructure, when designed with care and humanity, can shape societies and promote lasting peace. In summary, the Mauryan road network under Ashoka represents a remarkable chapter in the history of ancient roads. It highlights how connectivity can be harnessed not only for economic and political ends but also to nurture a more compassionate and enlightened civilization. This vision of roads as pathways of both commerce and conscience remains relevant as we consider the role of infrastructure in today's interconnected world. Engineering marvels of ancient roads, foundations of connectivity and durability. As we reflect on the vast networks of ancient roads that span continents and empires, from the Persian Royal Road to the Mauryan highways, one unifying theme emerges: the extraordinary engineering ingenuity that made these routes possible and enduring. The construction and maintenance of roads in antiquity required not just labor, but deep knowledge of materials, terrain, and design principles. These engineering achievements laid the groundwork for modern infrastructure and remain a testament to human creativity and resilience. One of the most iconic feats of ancient engineering was the construction of bridges, essential for crossing rivers, ravines, and other natural obstacles that would otherwise interrupt travel and communication. The Romans, for instance, perfected the stone arch bridge, a design so robust and efficient that many of these structures survive to this day, still admired for their beauty and strength. Using precisely cut stones arranged in an arch, Roman engineers could span wide gaps while evenly distributing weight, enabling roads to maintain continuity over challenging landscapes. Far across the globe, the Incas developed an entirely different but equally remarkable solution for mountainous terrain: rope suspension bridges. Crafted from braided plant fibers, these bridges stretched across deep canyons and turbulent rivers in the Andes. Although made from organic materials, their construction was remarkably durable and maintained through community effort for centuries. These bridges connected remote communities and facilitated the movement of armies, traders, and messengers across some of the most rugged landscapes on Earth. Beyond bridges, ancient engineers tackled the challenge of creating elevated roads and causeways in marshy or flood-prone areas. By raising roadbeds above the surrounding terrain, they ensured that paths remained passable even during heavy rains or seasonal flooding. This technique was crucial in regions such as Mesopotamia and parts of India, where waterways and wetlands were common features of the landscape. Proper drainage systems were another vital component of road engineering. Roads that accumulated water would quickly deteriorate, turning into mud traps that slowed travel and damaged materials. To combat this, builders incorporated side ditches, culverts, and underground channels to direct rainwater away from the road surface. This attention to drainage not only preserved the roads but also reduced maintenance costs and improved traveler safety. Strategically placed rest stops and way stations provided shelter, food, and fresh horses or porters along long routes. These stations served both logistical and social functions, offering travelers relief and opportunities to exchange information. In empires like Rome and Han China, the state maintained these facilities as part of their broader infrastructure strategy, underscoring the importance of roads beyond mere physical pathways. For navigation, ancient roads were marked with mile markers, milestones, and travel posts, which informed travelers of distances, directions, and sometimes important information about the region. The Romans famously erected milestones, miliaria, along their roads, standardized markers that told travelers how far they were from key cities like Rome. Some of these milestones survive as archaeological treasures and historical monuments, providing tangible links to the past. Similarly, the Ashoka pillars in India not only conveyed royal edicts but also acted as navigational and cultural markers along the Marian roads. These pillars, often topped with sculpted animals like lions, became symbols of the emperor's presence and authority, guiding travelers both physically and spiritually. Even in less centralized or smaller-scale road networks, such as those in ancient Greece, signage and landmarks helped orient travelers. In these fragmented landscapes, local communities maintained markers or shrines to assist pilgrims and merchants, blending practical navigation with cultural and religious significance. The engineering mastery of these ancient roads was not limited to the physical construction but extended into the logistical and administrative realms. Coordinating labor forces, sourcing materials, and maintaining infrastructure required sophisticated planning. Empires developed bureaucratic systems to oversee road building and upkeep, reflecting the road's strategic importance. The durability of many ancient roads is striking. Roman roads, for example, were built with multiple layers, large stones at the bottom, crushed gravel in the middle, and tightly packed paving stones on top, creating a surface that could withstand heavy traffic and harsh weather for centuries. Some modern roads in Europe still trace their routes directly over these ancient foundations, a testament to their enduring design. Similarly, Incan roads, though less monumental in appearance, used carefully fitted stones and meticulous drainage to last through the often brutal mountain climate. Their rope bridges were regularly maintained and rebuilt by local communities, demonstrating a blend of engineering and social cohesion. In short, the engineering achievements behind ancient roads were foundational to the success and longevity of empires. They enabled armies to mobilize rapidly, merchants to trade efficiently, and cultures to connect and flourish. These roads were more than dirt paths, they were sophisticated systems that integrated technology, governance, and human effort. Today, studying these engineering marvels offers valuable lessons for modern infrastructure, reminding us that durability, adaptability to the environment, and attention to traveler needs are timeless principles. The remnants of ancient roads, bridges, and markers still inspire engineers, historians, and travelers alike, connecting us to a shared heritage of innovation and human endeavor. The lasting legacy of ancient roads, foundations of our modern world. As we conclude our journey through the remarkable history of ancient roads, it becomes clear that these pathways were far more than mere stretches of dirt or stone. They were the lifelines of empires, the veins through which flowed the energy of commerce, military power, culture, and communication. The legacy of these roads stretches far beyond their original purpose, continuing to influence the modern world in profound and often subtle ways. Ancient roads laid the very foundation for the rise and sustainment of powerful empires across the globe. The ability to move armies swiftly and efficiently often meant the difference between conquest and collapse. Roman legions marched confidently across their vast network of stone-paved highways, enabling the empire to defend its borders, suppress rebellions, and extend its reach over 3 continents. Similarly, the Inca Empire's vast Andean road system allowed its rulers to maintain control over mountainous terrain that would otherwise be impassable. But these roads were not built solely for war. They were equally vital in shaping the economic landscapes of ancient societies. By connecting cities, towns, and rural areas, roads enabled the efficient transport of goods, spices, textiles, metals, and precious commodities that fueled trade both within empires and between distant cultures. Markets thrived along these routes, fostering economic interdependence and prosperity. The Persian Royal Road, for example, was a commercial artery that linked the heart of the empire to far-flung provinces, facilitating exchange and wealth accumulation on an unprecedented scale. Moreover, ancient roads were critical in the transmission of culture, religion, and ideas. Pilgrims traveled from all corners to sacred sites along well-maintained roads, spreading beliefs and rituals that shaped the spiritual fabric of societies. The Mauryan roads under Emperor Ashoka helped disseminate Buddhism, contributing to one of the world's major religions spreading far beyond its birthplace. The Roman roads enabled the diffusion of Roman law, language, and customs throughout Europe and beyond, laying cultural groundwork that persists in the modern Western world. These roads also fostered communication networks vital to governance. Imperial relay systems, such as the Persian couriers and Han Dynasty Yichuan, allowed messages to traverse vast distances with astonishing speed. This administrative connectivity helped rulers manage sprawling territories, respond to crises, and maintain cohesion among diverse populations. What is striking today is how many of these ancient routes continue to shape the infrastructure of our contemporary world. In Europe, many modern highways follow the exact paths laid down by Roman engineers over 2 millennia ago. Archaeologists and historians have mapped these ancient roads, revealing the skeletons of past civilizations embedded beneath modern cities and highways. Even in places like South America, the Inca road network influences current transportation corridors, underscoring the enduring practicality of their routes. In India, the ancient Mauryan roads pathways still inform modern roads and pilgrim trails, serving as living links between past and present. Beyond physical traces, these roads symbolize humanity's timeless drive to connect, explore, and organize. They remind us that the infrastructure we often take for granted today, roads, bridges, way stations, are part of a lineage of innovation and ambition stretching back thousands of years. In reflecting on this legacy, we see ancient roads as more than historical artifacts, they are foundational pillars of civilization. They shaped how societies developed economies, waged war, governed territories, and shared knowledge. The ingenuity and effort invested in these roads speak to a universal human desire to transcend geographical barriers and unite people through travel and exchange. Today's globalized world, with its vast networks of highways, railroads, and digital communication lines, stands on the shoulders of these ancient innovations. The challenges they addressed, distance, terrain, logistics, remain relevant. By studying their successes and failures, modern engineers and planners continue to learn how to build resilient, efficient infrastructure that supports thriving societies. In essence, ancient roads are embedded in the world we walk today, not just physically beneath our feet but in the very fabric of how we live, interact, and progress. They are silent witnesses to our shared past and enduring reminders of the power of connectivity. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through the ancient roads that shaped our world. From stone-paved Roman highways to daring Incan rope bridges, these paths reveal the power, innovation, and connection of civilizations long gone, but never forgotten. If you loved uncovering these hidden stories and want to explore more fascinating tales from history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. This is Thunga's Story Time, where history comes alive one story at a time. Until next time, keep exploring, keep wondering, and I'll see you in the next adventure. Welcome to Thunga's Story Time, where history isn't just remembered, it's relived. Today, we uncover one of the most chilling true stories in American history. A dream for a better life turned into a frozen nightmare in the Sierra Nevada. 87 pioneers set out for California. But only 48 made it out alive. What happened on that mountain? Why did the name Donner Party become synonymous with desperation and survival at all costs? This isn't folklore. This happened. And the truth is more terrifying than fiction. Stick around, because by the end of this story, you'll be asking yourself, would I have survived? Like, subscribe, and prepare for a journey into the darkest winter America has ever known. The beginning of a dream. Spring, 1846, along the American frontier. The year was 1846, and America was in the throes of manifest destiny, a belief, both romantic and ruthless, that the nation was divinely ordained to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For many, California was the last shining beacon on the western horizon, a golden land of fertile soil, opportunity, and second chances. It called out to farmers, tradesmen, widows, veterans, and dreamers alike. Among those who answered the call were two families from Illinois, the Donners and the Reeds. Like so many others, they were not born into wealth or privilege. But they carried with them the great currency of the American frontier, hope, grit, and the promise of freedom. In the spring of that year, they packed up their lives, plows, quilts, tools, and family Bibles, and joined a wagon train heading west along the Oregon Trail. George Donner, a 62-year-old farmer, and his younger brother Jacob were seasoned men of the land, respected in their community for their integrity and resolve. George was elected captain of the small caravan, soon to be known as the Donner Party. He traveled with his third wife, Tamsin, a school teacher of uncommon intellect and strength, and their 5 daughters. They were the embodiment of pioneer resilience, determined to carve out a future from the unknown. Alongside them were the Reeds. James Fraser Reed, an enterprising Irish-American businessman, saw California as a land not just of survival, but of prosperity. A former soldier and a man of vision, he was determined to lift his family into the ranks of California's emerging elite. With his wife Margaret, their 4 children, and an elderly mother-in-law suffering from consumption. The Reeds brought along not only covered wagons but a sense of upward mobility and ambition. Together, these families joined a larger group of travelers forming in Independence, Missouri, a bustling jumping-off point for thousands heading west. At first, their journey was optimistic, even celebratory. Children played among the prairie grasses. Campfires glowed beneath the stars. They sang songs, shared stories, and watched as endless skies gave way to rolling plains. The wagons moved in a slow, steady rhythm, no faster than an ox's pace. Days were long and dusty. Nights were colder than expected. But these pioneers knew hardship was part of the deal. They were ready for it. They had read the guidebooks, consulted maps, and stocked provisions. Their eyes were set firmly on California. By the time they reached Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming, it was early July. Spirits remained high. They had already crossed vast stretches of prairie, forded rivers, and endured storms. They were behind schedule, but not dangerously so. If the weather held and their luck continued, they would reach California before the first snows. It was there at Fort Laramie, however, that the seeds of disaster were sown. While resupplying, James Reed encountered a new guidebook penned by a man named Lansford Hastings. Hastings was promoting a shortcut, the so-called Hastings Cutoff, which promised to shave weeks off the journey by taking a southern route through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and the Salt Lake Desert. The idea was tantalizing. Everyone knew the Sierra Nevada could be deadly if reached too late in the season. A shortcut might mean safety, speed, and an earlier claim on California land. Reed, ever ambitious, was intrigued. Hastings' words were persuasive, and Reed became an early advocate of the detour. Others in the group were more skeptical, but George Dunner, trusting his friend and looking to avoid a dangerous race against winter, eventually agreed. It was a decision that would haunt them all. In the summer sun of 1846, the Sierra Nevada still seemed impossibly far away. The hardships of the trail had yet to truly test them. There was no way to know how uncharted, rugged, and deadly the new route would be. No way to predict how the shortcut would become a trap, or how the dream of California would soon twist into a nightmare of starvation, frostbite, and unthinkable choices. For now, they were still believers in the American promise. As the wagon wheels turned westward again, cutting a dusty line across the continent, the Dunner and Reed families carried with them not only the supplies needed for survival, but the shared conviction that whatever lay ahead, they could endure it together. They were not just travelers, they were builders of a new life. The Sierra Nevada waited in silence. The fatal shortcut. Summer, 1846, Fort Bridger to the Salt Desert. By late July 1846, the Donner-Reed party reached Fort Bridger, a modest trading post nestled in the remote highlands of what is now southwestern Wyoming. The fort was little more than a few rough cabins and corrals, but it served as a crucial stop for weary emigrants traveling west along the Oregon Trail. It was here that James Reed again encountered the name Lansford Hastings, a lawyer, explorer, and self-styled pathfinder whose recent guidebook, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, promised an alluring shortcut to the golden lands of the Pacific. The so-called Hastings Cutoff offered a bold alternative to the traditional trail, a route that would veer southwest through Utah's Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert before rejoining the California Trail. The supposed benefit? It would save the emigrants over 300 miles, a significant margin when every mile was earned at the slow pace of oxen-drawn wagons. But what Hastings failed to mention was that he had never actually traveled the route with wagons. His shortcut was largely theoretical and had not been tested under the grueling demands of pioneer caravans. In truth, it was a gamble, a roll of the dice made with other people's lives. Still, desperation has a way of clouding judgment. The Donner party was already behind schedule. They knew that if they reached the Sierra Nevada too late, early snows could trap them in the mountains. The thought of gaining precious time was tempting, perhaps even essential. At Fort Bridger, a note awaited them. Hastings himself had recently passed through and left a message encouraging others to follow him along the new route. The note was pinned to a forked branch, handwritten and confident, promising a fine road through to California. This message, and Reed's ambition, helped tip the scales. George Dunner, generally a cautious and democratic man, weighed the risks. But the group's urgency, coupled with the glowing promises of a shortcut, finally swayed him. With the vote cast, the Donner party broke from the main trail and turned southwest, into the wilderness. It was a decision that would mark the point of no return. Into the mountains. The first true test came swiftly. The Wasatch Mountains loomed ahead, not gently sloping hills but jagged, densely forested terrain. What Hastings had called a good wagon road was, in reality, no road at all. The emigrants had to cut a path themselves, using axes and brute strength to push their wagons through tangled woods and narrow ravines. It took more than 2 weeks to cover just 80 miles. Morale plummeted. Tempers flared. Time, the very thing they hoped to save, was being lost at an alarming rate. Provisions dwindled. Oxen grew weak from exhaustion and poor grazing. The shortcuts they had been promised turned out to be detours through hardship. Meanwhile, Hastings had moved on and was nowhere to be found. Still, The Donner Party pressed forward, clinging to the belief that the worst was behind them. It wasn't. The Great Salt Lake Desert. In early August, they descended from the mountains and emerged into the vast, shimmering expanse of the Great Salt Lake Desert. The sky stretched endlessly overhead. The ground was white, flat, and deceiving. It looked solid but was soft and crusted with salt. What little water they found was brackish and undrinkable. They had been told it would take 2 days to cross. It took nearly 5. Under a relentless sun, they trudged across the barren wasteland. Wagon wheels sank into the salty mud. Animals collapsed from thirst, their tongues swollen and their eyes hollow. Dozens of oxen were lost. Wagons had to be abandoned. Families walked for miles on foot, shoeless and sunburned, leaving behind precious possessions, trunks, furniture, even books and keepsakes, everything not essential to survival. James Reed, watching the desert claim their animals and supplies, wrote grimly in his journal, "We are now in a fix. God help us." The psychological toll was immense. Trust and leadership began to fracture. Reed, once a respected voice, now faced growing resentment. Men accused him of recklessness. Whispered fears turned into open tension. Hunger gnawed at them. Spirits sank. When they finally emerged from the desert's grasp, they were weeks behind schedule, short on food, and emotionally frayed. The shortcut had cost them dearly, and they were still hundreds of miles from the Sierra Nevada. No turning back. By mid-September, they rejoined the main California Trail near the Humboldt River, only to find the land crowded with emigrants who had taken the longer, but safer, route. These groups were in better shape, their oxen healthier, their wagons intact. It was a cruel irony. The shortcut had not only failed to save time, it had set them up for disaster. Still, the party pushed on. There was no other choice. California was ahead, and they had come too far to retreat. But winter was coming fast. And the Sierra Nevada, silent and snow-capped on the western horizon, was waiting. A path of hardship. Late summer to early fall, 1846, the Hastings Cutoff and beyond. The so-called shortcut had become a slow-motion disaster. After enduring the brutal passage through the Wasatch Mountains and the soul-crushing expanse of the Great Salt Lake Desert, the Donner Reed party staggered forward like survivors of a failed expedition, not pioneers forging a future, but wanderers chasing a rapidly fading hope. Their oxen, once strong and steady, were now gaunt, limping, and in many cases, dead. Wagons had splintered against rocky slopes and been buried in the salt crust of the desert. Every step westward was purchased with blood, sweat, and broken dreams. The Hastings Cutoff, far from saving time, had stolen precious weeks that were supposed to have delivered them into the fertile valleys of California before the snow began to fall. Now, in early September, they were still far from the Sierra Nevada, and winter was no longer a distant threat, it was a presence creeping at their heels. Exhaustion and fractures. The desert had burned more than the soles of their feet. It had burned their faith, in their leaders, in the trail, and sometimes even in one another. James Reed, whose advocacy of the shortcut had led them into the mountains and salt flats, found himself increasingly isolated. What had once been respect turned to resentment. Whispers of blame grew louder with every hardship. George Donner, quiet and deliberate, tried to hold the party together with reason and calm authority. But even he could not stop the unraveling. Morale had been shattered on the desert floor, and now tensions boiled just beneath the surface. Families clung to their wagons, now battered and stripped of all but the barest necessities. Clothing was tattered, hands blistered from cutting trails and pushing wheels. Meals grew smaller, thinner. Rations of bacon and flour were stretched with foraged roots or whatever game could still be hunted, though in these increasingly barren stretches, even the rabbits seemed to have vanished. And yet they pressed on, because there was no other choice. The Humboldt River, a glimmer of relief. When the party finally reached the Humboldt River, the sight of flowing water brought brief relief. The river offered a chance to replenish and regroup, and for a few days, the party dared to believe that the worst might be behind them. But the Humboldt corridor was not forgiving. The route followed the river westward into increasingly arid and rugged country, a gauntlet of dust, heat, and growing scarcity. Now they faced a new kind of torment, hostile terrain and dwindling resources. Grass for the oxen was sparse, water holes dried quickly, wood for fires was hard to find. With each mile, the party grew more desperate. Along the Humboldt, conflict erupted. A quarrel between James Reed and another man, John Snyder, over a tangled wagon and exhausted animals turned violent. In a moment of fury and fear, Reed stabbed Snyder with a knife. Snyder fell dead on the trail. The killing sent shockwaves through the group. Reed, seen by some as reckless and dangerous, was banished from the wagon train. His wife and children were allowed to stay, but he was sent ahead alone on horseback, exiled from the group he had once helped lead. Reed's departure was symbolic. The cohesion of the Donner Party had fractured. Trust was in tatters. Grief, hunger, and bitterness gnawed at the edges of civility. Graves on the trail. Along the way, the first graves were dug. The elderly and the sick began to succumb to exposure, exhaustion, and despair. A mother died of consumption. An infant passed away from fever. One by one, losses mounted, not only of people, but of spirit. Families wrapped their dead in blankets and buried them beneath shallow mounds of stone, marking the trail with sorrow. Many pioneers had imagined the West as a place of rebirth. Now it was becoming a graveyard. The Sierra Nevada looms. By late October, the party approached the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The air grew colder. The nights sharpened with frost. A few light snow flurries fell, a warning sign from the sky. They were within reach of California's green valleys. Just one last barrier stood in their way, the high mountain passes of the Sierra. If they could cross before the real snow arrived, they still had a chance. But the trail had claimed their strength. The oxen were faltering. Many wagons were in disrepair. Supplies were nearly gone. Even their will to push forward was being slowly eroded by fatigue. And then came the storm, nature's last laugh. On October 28th, as the party climbed toward Truckee Pass, a massive blizzard descended from the peaks. Snow fell thick and fast, burying the trail under feet of powder. The pass became impassable. Wagons stalled. Wheels locked. Hooves slipped on ice. They were trapped, just a day's journey from the edge of salvation. There would be no crossing before winter. With no choice left, the group retreated down the mountain and set up makeshift camps near what would become known as Donner Lake and Alder Creek. There, under towering pines and snow-laden skies, they built rudimentary cabins from fallen timber and hoped to wait out the storm. But the mountains offered no mercy. They had gambled on a shortcut. They had lost nearly everything. Now, they would have to survive the winter, with little food, no way out, and the full weight of nature pressing down upon them. Trapped by snow. Late October to winter, 1846, Sierra Nevada, near Donner Lake. After months of grueling travel, broken spirits, and mounting losses, the weary members of the Donner Party finally arrived at the base of the majestic Sierra Nevada. The towering peaks, often described as nature's fortress, had always been the final, daunting obstacle between the pioneers and their dream of California's fertile valleys. But in late October 1846, the mountains were far less welcoming than the pioneers had hoped. Instead of clear passes, the party found themselves staring into an early and unrelenting snowstorm, one that would change their fate forever. Arrival at the Sierra Nevada. For the emigrants, the sight of the snow-covered mountains was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Sierra Nevada loomed like the wall of ice and rock, the clouds heavy and dark above the jagged peaks. The party had been chasing the promise of California for months, yet now the dream seemed perilously out of reach. The weather was turning colder with every passing day, a bitter reminder that winter was no longer a threat on the horizon. It had arrived. Despite the cold and growing urgency, they began their ascent toward the Truckee Pass, a route that promised to lead them over the mountains and into the American River Valley. Their hopes were pinned on reaching the other side before the worst of the snowfalls. But nature had a different plan. The early snowstorm. On October 28th, just as the party neared the mountain pass, a violent blizzard struck. The wind howled through the pines, and snow fell with such intensity that visibility dropped to near zero. The temperature plummeted. The already difficult terrain became treacherous, wagons stuck fast, wheels jammed with ice and packed snow. The oxen, already exhausted from the journey, struggled to pull the wagons forward and many collapsed from fatigue and cold. The pioneers, some barely clothed in thin layers, were forced to abandon their wagons and seek shelter where they could. The wind bit through their clothes and chilled them to the bone. The children huddled close to their mothers, many coughing and shivering. Trapped at Donner Lake and Alder Creek. With the mountain pass impassable, the Donner Party had no choice but to retreat to lower ground and seek refuge near two nearby areas, Donner Lake, a glacial body of water framed by towering pines, and Alder Creek, a forested area not far away. There, they built crude shelters from fallen trees and whatever materials they could salvage from their broken wagons. The cabins were rough and far from comfortable, but they offered some protection from the relentless snow and freezing winds. Trapped, isolated, and desperate, the pioneers faced the bleak reality of being stranded for months. The onset of starvation. Supplies had been depleted during the long journey, and the months of travel had already sapped their food stores. As the snow piled higher and the days grew shorter, hunting and foraging became impossible. Their stock of dried meat, flour, and vegetables was dangerously low. Hungry and cold, many in the party began to lose weight and strength. Illness spread quickly through the cramped cabins. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. The once tight-knit group started to fray under the pressure. Desperate measures. Facing starvation and the unyielding winter, the Donner Party confronted grim choices. They ate whatever they could find, bark from trees, animal hides, and even the bones left behind by wildlife. Some boiled leather straps to soften them for eating. Still, it was not enough. As days turned to weeks, the situation deteriorated further. Some members began to perish from hunger and exposure. The death toll mounted, and the air grew heavy with grief and despair. Hope in the darkness, the forlorn hope. In early December, with starvation looming, a group of 15 brave souls, later called the Forlorn Hope, volunteered to make a perilous attempt to cross the snowbound mountains to seek help. They set off on foot, carrying little more than hope and determination against impossible odds. This desperate bid for survival symbolized the resilience and human spirit that persisted even in the darkest hours. The toll of winter. Back at the camps near Donner Lake and Alder Creek, conditions worsened as winter deepened. More lives were lost to frostbite, disease, and exhaustion. The survivors were trapped in a frozen prison of their own making, cut off from the outside world. Their suffering became a chilling tale of endurance and survival, but also one of profound tragedy. Legacy of the Trap Party. The ordeal of the Donner Party remains etched in American history, not only as a story of disaster but as a haunting reminder of the unforgiving power of nature and the limits of human endurance. The cabins by Donner Lake, the deaths, and the desperate choices would soon become legendary. Their story would provoke debate and reflection on human courage, morality, and the price paid in pursuit of a dream. Hunger, desperation, death. Winter, 1846 to 1847, trapped in the Sierra Nevada. As the unforgiving winter tightened its grip around the Donner Party's trap camps near Donner Lake and Alder Creek, the pioneers faced a chilling truth: their supplies were nearly gone, and nature's cruelty showed no mercy. The dwindling food supplies. The months-long journey had drained their food reserves, and the brief respite they had hoped for in the Sierra Nevada had turned into a nightmare. Their initial stockpile, flour, salted pork, dried beans, and coffee, was almost entirely consumed. Hunting was futile in the deep snow, and foraging was impossible beneath the thick blanket that smothered the forest floor. The pioneers had no choice but to turn to increasingly desperate measures to stave off starvation. Eating the unthinkable. At first, the group resorted to eating what little they could find that was not traditionally food. Tree bark, stripped from pine and cedar, was boiled into a bitter, slimy mush. Leather belts, wagon covers, and harnesses were soaked and boiled until softened enough to eat, a grim substitute for the meat and bread they so sorely missed. Some tried to eat animal bones, boiling them to extract what little marrow might remain. These makeshift meals provided faint sustenance but were hardly enough to keep the body alive. A grim reality: death. One by one, members of the party began to succumb. The cold was merciless, and without enough calories, bodies grew weak and vulnerable to frostbite, illness, and exhaustion. The sick and elderly were the first to perish. The cries of children, too weak to survive the cold, haunted the remaining survivors. Each death was a blow to the morale of the group, but also a grim reminder of the stakes. The psychological toll. Starvation and cold did more than sap the body, they tore at the mind. Desperation gave rise to fear, suspicion, and despair. Some settlers clung to their last shreds of hope, others lost themselves in hopelessness. Small disputes over dwindling supplies became frequent, trust eroded, and the fabric of the community began to unravel. The Forlorn Hope's journey. In this desperate time, the Forlorn Hope, a group of 15 who had set out earlier to seek rescue, faced unimaginable challenges. Their trek across the snow-covered mountains was perilous, marked by hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Many would not survive the journey, but their determination embodied the will to live. Those who made it to safety would eventually return with rescuers, but not before the camps were reduced to shadows of their former selves. Cannibalism, the last, horrifying choice. Faced with starvation and death, some survivors made a grim and terrifying choice. They resorted to cannibalism. Eating the flesh of those who had already died was an act born of desperation, an instinct for survival in a frozen wasteland where no other food remained. This horrifying reality shocked the outside world when rescuers arrived months later, and it has since become one of the most infamous and tragic aspects of the Donner Party saga. The winter of suffering. As winter deepened, the camps became a prison of snow and ice. Shelters were inadequate against the cold, food was scarce, and hope was in short supply. Families huddled together, mourning lost loved ones while trying to gather strength for the days ahead. The beginning of rescue. News of the stranded pioneers finally reached California towns, prompting relief efforts. Rescue parties were organized, but deep snow and harsh conditions made the journey treacherous and slow. When rescuers finally reached Donner Lake in February and March 1847, they found survivors in varying states of health, some near death, others clinging to life with astonishing resilience. The rescuers also uncovered the grim evidence of cannibalism and the extreme suffering endured. Legacy of endurance and tragedy. The story of hunger, desperation, and death in the Sierra Nevada remains a profound chapter in American history. It is a tale of human endurance tested to the absolute limit, of hope amid despair, and of choices forced by unimaginable circumstances. The Donner Party's tragic winter serves as a stark reminder of nature's power in the fragile line between survival and surrender. The Forlorn Hope. December 1846. Sierra Nevada mountains. As December deepened, the camps at Donner Lake and Alder Creek teetered on the brink of total collapse. Food was gone. Bodies lay buried in snowdrifts or beneath shallow earth, and the wind carried not only the sting of frost, but the growing silence of death. Survival seemed no longer a goal, but a delay of the inevitable. Yet even in this dire moment, the human spirit did not fully surrender. A decision was made, desperate, perhaps mad, but necessary. A group would set out on foot to find help. It would be the only chance the rest of the Donner Party had left. They called them the Forlorn Hope, a plan born of desperation. The idea had been discussed before, but now, with the snow piling higher each day and no sign of rescue, action had to be taken. 15 people, 10 men and 5 women, volunteered. These were not the healthiest, only the strongest survivors left. All others were too weak, too young, or too far gone to attempt such a journey. Among them were men like William Eddy, known for his endurance, and women like Mary Graves, whose determination had grown only sharper in tragedy. They knew the odds were long, and their chances of success slim. Still, staying meant death for everyone. Leaving meant hope. Their mission: traverse the snow-blanketed Sierra Nevada, reach the nearest settlement in California, over 100 miles away, and send back help. Ill-equipped and ill-fated, they prepared as best they could. Snowshoes were crafted from oxbow yokes, rawhide, and twine. Provisions were minimal: scraps of meat, hides, a few strips of jerky. Most were already starving before they left. All were exhausted. They wrapped themselves in blankets, worn clothing, and bits of salvaged material. There was no real protection against the snow, the wind, or the cold. On December 16, 1846, the Forlorn Hope departed. Behind them, grieving families watched from frost-covered shelters, knowing they might never see their loved ones again. The journey begins. The party struggled immediately. Snow was waist-deep, and their crude snowshoes sank underfoot. Travel was agonizingly slow. Their feet blistered and bled, and the biting cold numbed hands and faces until they turned white with frostbite. Each day was a blur of trudging forward, barely making progress. Nights were worse. Huddled together for warmth, they tried to sleep while hunger gnawed and wind howled through the trees. By the 4th day, their food was gone. A horrific turn. Soon, members began to collapse, unable to continue, unable to survive. The first to die was Antonio, a Mexican teamster. Then Patrick Dolan, who lost his mind before he lost his life. Snow blinded some, and starvation shrank others to little more than skin and bone. With each death, the survivors faced the same horror that had haunted the camps behind them. Should we eat the dead? It was unthinkable, and yet, it was survival. They made the same desperate decision. Flesh was stripped from the bodies of the dead, carefully rationed. Some refused to partake at first, but as the days dragged on, even the strongest will broke beneath the weight of starvation. The line between humanity and instinct blurred, but it kept them alive. Death along the trail. The cold and deprivation continued to take their toll. One of the women, Sarah Fosdick, watched her husband perish. Mary Graves lost her brother. The group's number shrank daily, and the snow kept falling, covering the trail and forcing them to backtrack or push forward blindly. At one point, they became so disoriented that they traveled in circles for days. Still, a core of the group pressed on. William Eddy and William Foster, driven by the will to return for their families, helped keep the group focused. The survivors marched with frozen feet, blackened by frostbite, on limbs that barely obeyed them. A flicker of salvation. After more than 30 days in the wilderness, the battered remnants of the Forlorn Hope emerged from the Sierra Nevada foothills and stumbled into a Native American village. The Miwok people took them in, fed them, and nursed their wounds. Eventually, word reached nearby settlements in the Sacramento Valley. The incredible story of the Donner Party's plight spread quickly, and action was taken. A rescue effort was launched. Legacy of the Forlorn Hope. Only 7 of the original 15 survived the journey. But their sacrifice and courage changed everything. They had crossed the mountains, survived snowstorms, starvation, and madness, and returned with the most important thing of all, hope. Because of them, rescue parties were formed. Supplies, blankets, and sleds were packed. Men volunteered, despite the risk, to trek back into the mountains to save those who had been left behind. The Forlorn Hope became a symbol, not of glory, but of raw, desperate perseverance. A chapter of unimaginable suffering, but also unbreakable resolve. They had walked through hell, and they had returned. Cannibalism in the wild. Winter 1846-47, Sierra Nevada and beyond. As the Forlorn Hope trudged through the snow-covered Sierra Nevada, the horror they left behind continued to unfold in the camps near Donner Lake and Alder Creek. Death had arrived in silence, slow and cold, like the wind carving through their makeshift shelters. But what came next would become one of the darkest chapters in the history of American expansion, the moment the unthinkable became survival. The first horrors among the Forlorn Hope. Even before the world heard whispers of cannibalism in the snow, it had already begun. In the wilderness, far from rescue or reprieve, the members of the Forlorn Hope, those 15 desperate souls who struck out from the lake, began to die one by one. When Antonio, Patrick Dolan, and others perished, the remaining survivors were faced with a dilemma that shook them to their core. They had no food. No game had appeared. No fish swam beneath the frozen creeks. No roots or bark could satisfy their gnawing hunger. They were beyond starvation. They were dying. And so, they did the unthinkable. In the bitter cold, flesh did not decay. It remained, frozen and still, as if nature itself offered it up. With trembling hands and tearful prayers, they began to cut. They cooked the flesh over small fires, attempting to make it feel less monstrous, more human. But there was no denying what it was: cannibalism, born not of malice, but of necessity. Some resisted, sickened by the very idea. Others partook reluctantly. Still others, as days wore on, came to see it not as evil but as salvation. This was not a meal, it was the last defense against death. The camps follow suit. Back at Donner Lake and Alder Creek, the same agony was unfolding. They had watched the forlorn hope disappear into the woods with a flicker of hope, but as days turned to weeks, that hope faded. The snow grew deeper. The cold worsened. And still, no rescue came. There was nothing left to eat. The last of the oxen bones had been boiled to jelly. Hide was gone. Tree bark had been scraped from every reachable trunk. Leather soaked into soft mush became one more grim ration, but even that ran out. And then, people began to die. They died slowly, their bodies shrinking into pale, still shapes beneath animal hides and makeshift blankets. Children died in their mothers' arms. Old men faded beside their wives. Entire families perished together. And once again, the survivors faced a choice no human being ever wishes to confront. The breaking point. It did not happen all at once. At first, they buried the dead, if they had the strength to dig through snow and frozen earth. But as death continued, and the living became fewer and weaker, the burials stopped. One survivor later wrote that a woman, grief-stricken and starving, began to cut flesh from her dead husband while their child slept. Another man, near delirium, saw in his fallen friend not a corpse, but nourishment. It was not murder. It was not cruelty. It was desperation. It was the raw will to live. In the silence of the mountains, the line between survival and morality blurred. The will to see another sunrise eclipsed the fear of damnation. They wept. They prayed. Then they ate. The weight of choice. Cannibalism among the Donner Party has long been the focus of morbid fascination. But in truth, it was a horror none of them wanted, and few could speak of afterward. Many survivors never admitted to it publicly. Those who did carried the weight in silence, met with a mix of sympathy and judgment. But in the moment, starving, dying, surrounded by the dead, there was no debate, no abstract ethics. There was only the choice: eat or die. Some refused. A few chose death over desecration. But many, mothers, fathers, even children, ate from those who had once sat beside them, laughed with them, prayed with them. What the rescuers found. When the first rescue party finally arrived in February 1847, they found a scene more haunting than any tale of the frontier. Emaciated figures emerged from cabins half buried in snow. Children too weak to stand. Adults with frostbitten limbs, haunted eyes, and near animal exhaustion. And then, the rescuers saw the remains, bones picked clean, limbs charred in fire pits, corpses mutilated, flesh missing. Some turned away in revulsion. Others, hardened frontiersmen themselves, understood. They knew what hunger could drive a person to do. Still, the news shocked the nation. A nation reacts. When word reached the East Coast, it ignited a firestorm of fascination and revulsion. Newspapers described it as the cannibal tragedy, painting lurid scenes of frontier madness. Writers debated morality, preachers spoke of divine punishment. Some called the Donners heroes of survival, others whispered that they had gone too far. But few could imagine what it was like to starve in the Sierra Nevada, to watch your children die, to choose between your own life and the body of someone you once loved. Legacy of the unthinkable. The cannibalism endured by the Donner Party is not just a tale of horror. It is a window into the edge of human endurance, the unimaginable choices people face when all else is stripped away. In their darkest hour, the survivors of the Donner Party clung to life in the only way they could. They broke taboo not out of evil, but out of need, and they lived to tell the tale that no one wanted to hear. Their story is a caution, not only about the perils of poor decisions or the brutality of nature, but about the limits of what a person can bear when every light has gone out. Rescue arrives, too late for many. February to April 1847, Sierra Nevada. As January turned into February, whispers of concern in California's outposts grew louder. Rumors spread, the Donner Party hadn't arrived. The mountains were buried in snow. No word had come. And so, the long-dreaded truth began to surface: something had gone terribly wrong in the Sierra Nevada. The alarm is raised. It was a lone survivor, a staggering, frost-bitten member of the Forlorn Hope, half-mad from exposure, who first reached Sutter's Fort and gasped out the story. The party was trapped. Dozens were still in the mountains. Starving. Freezing. Dying. The response was swift, but limited. California was still frontier land, poor in resources, overextended in conflict, and tangled in politics. Yet within days, citizens, ranchers, and officials pooled what they could. Supplies were gathered. Mules loaded. A rescue party was formed. They knew they had little time. What they didn't know was how much of that time had already run out. The first rescue party. In mid-February 1847, the first relief party reached the base of the Sierra Nevada. As they climbed, the white wilderness thickened around them, snowdrifts taller than men, winds like blades, silence like a shroud. The trail had long since disappeared. Only instinct and scraps of direction guided them. When they finally approached Donner Lake, what they saw was not a camp, but a graveyard. Figures emerged slowly from cabins half swallowed by snow. Emaciated, their eyes sunken, their limbs stick-thin. Some were too weak to speak. Others fell to their knees and wept. Children stared blankly, too far gone to recognize help. Inside the cabins, the rescuers found scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Frozen bodies stacked in corners. Bones cracked open for marrow. Skulls half buried in snow. Piles of belongings abandoned mid-meal, long since consumed. The rumors were true, and worse. Relief turns to grief. Though they had brought food, blankets, and hope, the rescuers were quickly overwhelmed. There were too many mouths to feed. Too many bodies to bury. Too many broken souls. The rescuers prioritized. The strongest would be taken out first, on snowshoes and makeshift sleds. The rest would be left behind, with promises that another party was coming. But not everyone believed it. And not everyone could wait. Some survivors begged to be taken. Others simply cried. A few who were too weak, or too far gone, asked to be left to die. A young boy reportedly whispered to a rescuer, "Don't forget the others." The man never did. The long haul down. As the first group of survivors was led down the mountains, the journey itself became another nightmare. Blizzards returned. Snow thickened. One child died en route. Several others collapsed and had to be carried. Even with food, the human body cannot rebound from the edge so quickly. Frostbite set in. Delirium took hold. At least one adult survivor went mad, convinced the rescuers were demons come to torment her. But slowly, painfully, they reached the valleys below. News of the Donner disaster spread like wildfire across California, and from there, across the country. More rescue attempts. In the following weeks, 3 more relief parties followed. Each faced brutal conditions. Each carried hope, and each encountered horror. The second relief found Alder Creek, where the Donner family had camped. There, George Donner lay dying with a festering wound. His wife, Tamsin Donner, had refused to leave him behind, though she was starving. Their children were evacuated, but she stayed, and would never come down the mountain alive. The third relief found children too weak to stand. A mother cradled her dead infant. Bodies lined in the snow showed signs of more cannibalism. The rescuers, though hardened men, wept openly. The fourth relief, arriving in April, found only a handful of survivors, and bones. Just bones. By then, winter had claimed its due. Death toll and survival. Of the 87 members who began the journey, only 48 survived. Nearly half had perished, most from starvation, some from exposure, and a few from injuries or illness that help might have cured. Men, women, children. No age was spared. No family untouched. The Reeds made it out largely intact, thanks in part to James Reed, who had been exiled months earlier but organized rescues once he reached California. The Donner family fared far worse. George and Tamsin Donner both died in the mountains, along with many of their kin. Shock across the nation. When word of the Donner tragedy reached the East, the public reaction was overwhelming. Newspapers published sensational headlines: "Cannibalism in the Sierras, horrors of the West, a frontier nightmare." Sermons were delivered. Moral judgments rendered. Debates erupted about the ethics of survival, the limits of human endurance, and the folly of manifest destiny. Yet beneath the outrage was something deeper, a growing realization that the American West was not simply a land of gold and glory, but of profound risk and untamed nature. The mountains were real. The cold was real. And the cost of arrogance or poor planning could be death. The survivor's burden. For those who survived, the rescue was not an end. It was a beginning of lifelong trauma, social stigma, and spiritual scars. Some survivors were treated as heroes. Others as monsters. Especially those linked to the cannibalism. The forlorn hope became both famous and infamous, interviewed, analyzed, praised, and condemned. Children grew up under the shadow of what they had seen. Parents were haunted by what they had done. Even in old age, when interviewed decades later, many refused to talk about the darkest days, but they never forgot. A caution for generations. The rescue efforts, the heroic, came too late for many. But they also revealed something enduring, that in the face of the most horrific circumstances, ordinary people can still choose compassion, courage, and sacrifice. Those who climbed the mountains, who carried children in their arms, who gave up food for others, who returned again and again into the jaws of death, those were heroes, too. And while the Donner Party remains a tale of warning, the rescue is its counterpoint, a reminder that even in darkness, there can be light. A nation reacts. Spring 1847 and beyond. When the final survivors of the Donner Party emerged from the Sierra Nevada in late April 1847, their story didn't remain tucked away in a mountain pass. It exploded across the American consciousness. Within weeks, the tragedy had become the most talked about calamity in the nation, a grim parable of human endurance, moral collapse, and the perilous price of ambition. Headlines of horror. Newspapers from New York to New Orleans plastered their front pages with chilling details. Some printed first-hand survivor accounts. Others speculated wildly, fueling an appetite for shock. What began as tragedy quickly turned into national theater. 87 Go West, 49 Return. The cannibals of California. Women ate their dead, men lost to madness. Readers were captivated. People gathered in saloons, churches, and city squares to hear the latest updates. The story of the dinner party struck at something primal. It was not just a tale of misadventure, but a mirror held up to American values. What would you do if you were starving? Would you save your children or yourself? Could civilization survive when stripped of its comforts? Debates on morality and survival. Churches across the country filled with sermons. Ministers thundered from pulpits. The Donner tragedy was punishment for arrogance, a sign that man should not challenge nature or God. Others used the tale to condemn manifest destiny itself, a fool's errand leading families into ruin. Philosophers, writers, and academics joined the conversation. The central question was no longer about geography, it was about the human soul. What is the line between survival and savagery? Is cannibalism a sin if it's the only way to live? Can desperation excuse the unthinkable? Even years later, these questions would appear in literature, courtrooms, and political speeches. A mirror for the American dream. The Donner tragedy struck a nerve because it shattered the illusion of the West as a land of endless opportunity. For a decade, settlers had pushed westward, urged by the drumbeat of manifest destiny. California was painted as paradise. The trails were supposed to be hard, but not deadly. The Donner Party became a cautionary tale. The American dream, when pursued recklessly, could become an American nightmare. People began to question the advertisements that promised easy travel. The guidebooks, especially Lansford Hastings' infamous Emigrant's Guide, were scrutinized and condemned. Hastings' shortcut was now seen as a symbol of fatal hubris. The stigma of survival. While the public was fascinated, they were not always kind. Survivors of the Donner Party often found themselves haunted by stigma. The mere fact that one had lived invited suspicion. What had you done to survive? Were you one of the cannibals? Did you eat your neighbor? Your child? Women were sometimes spared the harshest criticism. They were seen as victims. But men, especially those in leadership roles, faced harsh judgments. Some were branded cowards. Others were accused of greed, cowardice, or cruelty. Whether the accusations were true hardly mattered. The stain stuck. Many survivors refused to speak of what happened. Some changed their names. Others moved far from California, hoping anonymity might buy peace. One survivor, when asked about the experience decades later, simply replied, "The mountains took more than flesh. They took who we were." The birth of the Cannibal West myth. The sensationalism surrounding the Donner Party contributed to a dark romanticism of the American frontier. The West, once advertised as fertile, pure, and bountiful, was now tinged with Gothic horror. Writers and journalists seized on this tone. The Cannibal West became a literary motif, reappearing in novels, plays, and tall tales. The Sierra Nevada became not just a mountain range, but a symbol of danger, mystery, and madness. Children whispered stories of the Donner ghosts. Travelers spoke in hushed tones about Alder Creek. Even into the 20th century, the name Donner carried a chill. Government and trail reform. The federal government, rattled by public outcry, took quiet steps in response. Trail guides were reevaluated. Military forts were expanded along westward routes to offer food and protection. Settlers were advised to travel earlier, prepare better, and avoid untested shortcuts. The U.S. Army even commissioned reports on the best emigration paths, hoping to prevent another tragedy. Though no formal law was passed in response to the Donner disaster, its legacy was etched into every wagon train that came after. The ghost of 1846-47 rode with every pioneer who dared the wilderness. Art and memory. Artists captured the grim beauty of the tale. Oil paintings of snow-covered cabins, engravings of starving families, lithographs showing the forlorn hope struggling through mountain passes. One sculpture, commissioned years later, showed a mother shielding her children from the cold, her face etched with both love and terror. In 1918, a monument was erected near Donner Lake. It stands 22 feet tall, the height of the snowdrifts that winter. Its plaque reads, "Virile to risk and find, kindly with all and a ready help." It honors both the dead and the brave who came to their rescue. The legacy of warning. What remains most enduring is not just the horror, but the lesson. The Donner Party taught Americans that nature is not an enemy, but it is unforgiving. It cannot be rushed, lied to, or conquered by optimism alone. It also revealed something deeper about the American character, a will to survive, yes, but also a capacity for both kindness and cruelty in equal measure. Some stole from the weak. Others carried children miles on their backs. Some gave up their rations. Others gave up their humanity. The Donner Party is not simply a story of cannibalism or tragedy. It is a story of choices under pressure, of civilization tested by nature, of how thin the veil between order and chaos truly is. Conclusion. As the United States continued to expand westward, the story of the Donner Party faded into history books, then into legend. But it never disappeared. Every generation retells it, with horror, with pity, with awe. Because in that lonely stretch of snowy mountains, the myth of the frontier collided with its reality. And America, looking into that frozen mirror, saw something terrifying. It saw itself. The survivor's burden. 1847 and the long years after. When the snow finally thawed in the Sierra Nevada and the last rescue party descended from the mountains in April 1847, 48 souls had survived the ordeal of the Donner Party. But the wilderness had not let them go easily. The survivors carried more than frostbite and malnutrition. They carried the weight of memory, scars not visible on the skin, but etched deep in the soul. They had survived the unthinkable. But surviving wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a burden. Returning to a world that had moved on. Many survivors returned to civilization with a quiet hope, to resume their lives, to rebuild what had been lost, to forget. But forgetting was impossible. Their names had been printed in newspapers. Their actions whispered about in towns and saloons. No matter where they went, the past clung to them like the Sierra snow. Donner, Reed, Breen, Murphy. Graves. To the public, these were no longer just names, they were symbols of a horror tale that had captivated the nation. Some found compassion. Others met revulsion. A mother seeking work might be told, "We don't want cannibals here." A child might hear taunts at school, "Did your mama eat someone?" Even those who had never consumed human flesh were not spared suspicion. The line between victim and monster had blurred. The Reed family, redemption and resilience. James Reed, banished from the party months earlier after a fatal dispute, was among the few who survived without enduring the winter camps. He had made it safely to California and had returned with the first rescue party to find his wife and children still alive. Unlike many, Reed used his survival to forge a future. He settled in San Jose, became a respected businessman, and helped others arriving from the east. He rarely spoke of the mountains, but in private, he carried the guilt of having left. Despite having come back, his family prospered. But they were the exception, not the rule. Others were not so lucky. Tamsin Donner, the matriarch of the Donner family, stayed behind with her injured husband George, refusing rescue so that their children could be saved. She died in the snow, her body never recovered. Their daughters, rescued in separate waves, grew up with the knowledge that their mother had chosen their lives over her own. Some saw this as noble. Others called it foolish. But to the children, it was simply heartbreak. Louis Giesberg, the last survivor found at the camp, became one of the most controversial figures of the saga. Rumors swirled that he had murdered for meat. Though no court ever convicted him, the press and public made him a villain. He spent years trying to clear his name, but the whisper of cannibal followed him to his grave. Giesberg later opened a restaurant. Few came. Lifelong trauma. Many survivors displayed signs we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares. Panic attacks. Silence. Some avoided snow for the rest of their lives. Others could not abide the smell of boiling meat or the sound of a howling wind. Children who had endured the camps often grew up with a fierce, almost anxious love of family, afraid to lose them again. Survivors rarely spoke of that winter. When they did, it was often in fragments, with long pauses and trembling hands. One woman wrote in her journal, "We went up the mountain as people. We came down as shadows." Stories passed down, or not. Some families preserved the memory carefully, telling the tale around firesides not as horror, but as heritage, a testament to strength and faith. Others buried the truth. Grandchildren grew up unaware of the legacy that slept in their blood. In time, survivors began to die, one by one. Some left behind letters, some gave interviews late in life. A few, like Virginia Reed, James Reed's daughter, wrote accounts to set the record straight. She famously urged others, "Never take no cutoffs, and hurry along as fast as you can." The children of the Donner Party. Of the 48 survivors, 21 were children. Their survival was hailed as a miracle, but it also presented a contradiction: innocence rescued by acts too dark to understand. Some of those children went on to live full lives. They married, had children, and became part of the great westward expansion. Yet within their families, the story always lingered, often surfacing in moments of silence rather than speech. They were proof that life continued. But they were also living reminders of the cost of survival. What was learned? The survivors became unintentional teachers. Their story reshaped how Americans thought about westward travel. People packed more supplies, heeded the warnings of weather and terrain, and began to understand that maps were not promises. Future expeditions were safer, not because of new roads, but because of hard-won knowledge soaked in suffering. And yet, the moral lessons were less clear. What does it mean to survive when others do not? Who decides what is justifiable in extremity? The Donner survivors didn't offer answers, they simply stood as proof that humans could endure more than anyone imagined, and that survival had a price. Final years and deaths. By the 1870s and 1880s, most of the survivors had died. Some were remembered with affection and sorrow. Others were forgotten or ignored. The last known survivor of the Donner Party, Eliza Donner Houghton, died in 1922 at the age of 80. She had been just a child in the snow. Later in life, she wrote a book, The expedition of the Donner Party and its tragic fate, hoping to offer context, dignity, and perhaps closure. Legacy in stone. Today, at Donner Memorial State Park near the lake that now bears the family's name, a stone pedestal rises 22 feet high, the depth of that season's snowfall. Inscribed at its base, to all pioneers who crossed the Sierra Nevada. Not to heroes. Not to villains. But to pioneers, those who risked everything. The monument does not glorify cannibalism or sanitize suffering. It stands in silence, in snow, in wind. It asks no questions. It offers no answers. It simply remembers. A legacy etched in snow. The story that refused to melt away. Long after the wagons broke and the screams were silenced by snow, long after the survivors grew old and the headlines faded, the story of the Donner Party still lingers, etched not just in history books, but in the very landscape itself. The land remembers. Donner Lake, a silent witness. Nestled beneath the towering pines of the Sierra Nevada, Donner Lake shimmers quietly in the sunlight. To the casual traveler, it is a place of scenic beauty. Kayakers gliding across still waters, families hiking wooded trails, snow thick on the mountaintops in winter. But for those who know the history, every flake of snow carries the weight of suffering. Every tree whispers a name lost in the blizzard. This is not just a lake. It is a memorial. The site where the Donner Party camped through the harrowing winter of 1846-47, where cabins once stood and where bodies once lay beneath snowdrifts, is now Donner Memorial State Park. A monument of granite and bronze towers 22 feet above the ground, deliberately built to match the depth of the snowfall that year. At its base, a plaque reads, "Burial to risk and find, kindly with all and a ready helper to the weak, his ways were the ways of honor." The words speak not just of those who died, but of a generation who believed they could tame anything, even the wilderness. Why we still remember. The Donner story persists not because of its horror, but because of its meaning. It's a mirror, held up to the American soul. It asks hard questions. How far will you go for a better life? What will you sacrifice to save your family? What parts of your humanity can survive when everything else is stripped away? These aren't just questions for the 19th century. They're timeless. For every generation that follows, the Donner Party serves as a cautionary tale. About ambition without foresight. About listening to untested voices. About ignoring warnings from nature, and from within. Yet it is also a story of resilience. Of parents dying so children might live. Of strangers helping strangers in the bitterest cold. Of hope refusing to die even when bodies did. A Western myth turned human. In the American mythos, the West was a blank canvas. A place where dreams could be painted in bold strokes. But the mountains were never blank. The land was not passive. The story of the Donner Party reminds us, the wilderness doesn't care about your dreams. Unlike sanitized frontier tales of cowboys and gold seekers, the Donner tragedy reveals the darker side of manifest destiny, the arrogance of conquest, the gamble of shortcuts, and the human cost of progress. In that way, the Donner Party isn't just a tragedy. It's a reckoning. Modern interpretations. Today, historians, writers, filmmakers, and artists continue to revisit the Donner story, not to exploit its horror, but to understand it. Academic papers analyze survival ethics. Psychologists study trauma responses from the survivors. Novels and films reimagine the events, from supernatural horror to intimate drama. Visitors to the park walk interpretive trails and read placards detailing each stage of the journey. Schoolchildren from California learn the story as part of their state history. Some are shocked. Some are moved. All remember. Each winter, the snow falls again, just as it did in 1846. And somewhere on that landscape, someone always pauses to look out across the lake and wonder, would I have survived? Would I have done the same? From horror to heritage. The transformation from taboo to tribute did not happen overnight. In the 19th century, the story was whispered. By the early 20th, it was studied. By the 21st, it had become part of the larger American narrative. But the process was painful. Survivors were once shunned. Their children were once ashamed. Now, they are remembered as part of a lineage of resilience. Their choices are not easily judged, nor easily forgotten. The site of Alder Creek, where George and Tamsin Donner made their final stand, is still marked. Not by fanfare, but by simplicity. A clearing. A quiet. A stillness that speaks more than words. The monument's message. The 22-foot monument does not shout. It does not depict cannibalism. It does not accuse or absolve. Instead, it stands tall and still, like the trees around it, with snow at its base and history in its shadow. It speaks softly, in the language of grief and survival. This happened. These people lived. These people died. Remember them. Lessons carried forward. The Donner Party changed how wagon trains were planned. It altered the trust given to self-proclaimed guides. It shifted how the American public saw both the peril and promise of the West. But perhaps more importantly, it showed the world that survival is rarely clean. That heroism and horror can exist side by side. That history is not just facts, it is pain, it is choices, it is people. Snow that never melts. More than a century and a half has passed since the dinner party's last fire was extinguished. The world has changed, railroads, highways, smartphones. But when the wind howls through the Sierra trees in winter, and the snow begins to rise, the past returns. The story endures not just in museums or markers, but in us, in our fascination, in our empathy, in our warning systems and winter kits and second thoughts before shortcuts. The tragedy of the dinner party is not just a chapter of history. It is a legacy etched in snow. The story of the dinner party isn't just about tragedy, it's about choices, human limits, and the terrifying price of ambition. If this tale gave you chills, made you think, or left you speechless, that's the power of true history. At Thunga's Story Time, we bring you the haunting, the heroic, and the hidden stories you never learned in school. Don't just watch history, experience it. Right pointing finger emoji, hit that subscribe button, tap the bell emoji, for more true stories that will move, shock, and stay with you. Because the past has secrets. And we're just getting started. Thanks for watching, and remember, some stories are cold for a reason. Welcome back to Thunga's Story Time, where history comes alive with the drama it truly deserves. Today, we're diving into the life of the woman who shattered every rule, outmaneuvered emperors, and built a dynasty with nothing but her wits and willpower. She started as a concubine, but rose to become China's one and only female emperor. That's right, Wu Zetian didn't just play the game of power, she rewrote the entire script. Schemes, betrayals, secret police, palace coups, it's like Game of Thrones, but real, and set in the heart of ancient China. So grab your tea, sit back, and prepare to meet the most dangerous and brilliant woman the Chinese Empire ever produced. Let's begin. Wu Zetian, origins of an unlikely empress. In the grand sweep of Chinese imperial history, few figures stand out as boldly, or as controversially, as Wu Zetian. She remains the only woman to ever rule China as emperor in her own name, breaking through barriers that had confined women to the shadows of power for millennia. But before she commanded an empire, Wu was a girl born into privilege, sharpened by ambition, and shaped by a vision of her own destiny. A birth beyond fortune. Wu Zetian was born in 624 CE during the early years of the Tang dynasty, a time of revival and prosperity for China. Her family, the Wu clan, was not of noble blood but had accumulated substantial wealth through commerce. Her father, Wu Shiwo, was a successful timber merchant who earned a modest government post, and her mother came from the influential Yang family. While not aristocrats, the Wu family enjoyed comfort, stability, and social standing, an important launchpad for a daughter who would one day dream of ruling a dynasty. In a society where most girls were destined for a life behind closed doors, confined to domestic roles or, at best, the wives and mothers of powerful men, Wu Zetian's path was already unusual. Her father, enlightened for his time, believed in the value of education and encouraged his daughter to study. Wu grew up reading classical texts, learning history, mastering calligraphy, and even discussing philosophy and politics, subjects largely reserved for boys. An education uncommon for her time. At a time when literacy was rare even among noble women, Wu Zetian's ability to read and write fluently made her exceptional. She was not just literate, she was articulate, persuasive, and insightful. While many girls were taught to be obedient and modest, Wu questioned, challenged, and argued. She studied the Confucian classics that emphasized female submission but clearly saw herself in a different light. The books gave her more than knowledge, they gave her vision. This early exposure to ideas and critical thought lit a fire in Wu. She developed a hunger not just to learn, but to lead. Her confidence, intelligence, and discipline set her apart, and even as a teenager, she was said to have a poise and presence that made others take notice. In the eyes of her family and neighbors, she was a precocious girl. In her own eyes, she was someone destined for more than the limitations placed on her gender. Shaped by the times, driven by ambition. China in the 7th century was a land of complexity, an empire teeming with contradictions. The Tang dynasty was open to new ideas, religions, and peoples. It embraced trade and culture. But it was still deeply patriarchal. Power belonged to men, and women were expected to support, not to lead. Wu Zetian saw these contradictions not as barriers but as opportunities. She recognized that the Tang court, though dominated by men, was also a place where intelligence and skill could sometimes outweigh birthright. She understood that to rise, she would need more than beauty, she would need to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast her competitors. And so she began to imagine a path no woman had dared to walk, a path to political power. The court awaits. At the age of 14, Wu Zetian's life took a dramatic turn. She was selected to enter the court of Emperor Taizong, the reigning Tang emperor. There, she was given the title Karen, a 5th-rank concubine, not high enough to influence the emperor directly, but close enough to observe how power moved within the palace walls. To outsiders, this might have seemed like the end of her story, a bright girl absorbed into the imperial machine, destined to fade into obscurity. But for Wu, it was only the beginning. Her time in the court was not wasted, it was a masterclass in politics, human nature, and survival. She studied the people around her, the ministers, the eunuchs, the empresses, and learned the rules of the game they played. More importantly, she kept her ambitions intact. She knew she would not remain in the shadows forever. Legacy in motion. Looking back at Wu Zetian's early years, one cannot help but marvel at the clarity with which she understood her place in the world, and how she would reshape it. She was born into privilege, yes, but not into power. That she would one day seize the throne was inconceivable to her contemporaries. Yet every step of her early life, the education, the discipline, the sharpness of her mind, pointed towards something greater. Wu Zetian's story reminds us that greatness is not only born from opportunity but from audacity. She did not wait for the world to make space for her. She carved her own place into history, starting from the moment she picked up a book and refused to believe it was not meant for her. Wu Zetian, Into the Dragon's Court. At 14 years old, Wu Zetian left behind the relative freedoms of her childhood and entered the Forbidden City, one of the most secretive and powerful places in the world. She was chosen to become a concubine of Emperor Taizong, the formidable ruler of the Tang dynasty. Though she held only the low rank of Karen, a fifth-tier concubine in the vast imperial harem, this seemingly minor role would serve as the next step in her quiet but deliberate journey toward the throne. Life behind the curtain. The imperial court was a world apart from anything Wu had known. It was both dazzling and dangerous, filled with beauty, art, and splendor, but also teeming with political intrigue and ruthless ambition. Within the walls of the palace, hundreds of women competed for favor and status, their lives controlled by the ebb and flow of imperial whim. For most, this life was a gilded cage. But for Wu Zetian, it was a living laboratory. She was not a favored concubine. Emperor Taizong, already in his 40s, had his preferred women, and Wu, young, unconnected, and without noble backing, was unlikely to stand out. But she did not waste her time trying to compete through beauty or charm. Instead, she observed. She listened. She learned. She watched how ministers whispered to the emperor, how eunuchs carried messages, and how small gestures, an offering of tea, a well-timed compliment, a subtle glance, could shift the mood of the most powerful man in China. While other concubines sought comfort or status, Wu Zetian took mental notes. Every conversation, every decision, every punishment and reward became data in her growing understanding of how power operated. She was playing the long game. The emperor's library. One of Wu's few duties was to manage and catalog books in the emperor's private library, a position considered menial by most palace women. But for Wu Zetian, it was a dream assignment. Surrounded by scrolls of history, philosophy, politics, and military strategy, she deepened her knowledge of empire. She studied the lives of past rulers, learned the mistakes of failed dynasties, and absorbed the wisdom of great thinkers. And in these scrolls, Wu discovered something else, a confirmation that knowledge, more than bloodline or beauty, was the key to influence. She read the classics but questioned them. She studied Confucian doctrine, which said women should serve men, and yet found within those teachings loopholes, contradictions, and tensions that a clever woman could one day exploit. Though her days were filled with obedience, her mind remained independent, and dangerously ambitious. A fateful connection. During her time in the court, Wu Zetian caught the attention not just of Taizong, but of someone else, his son, Prince Liji. Unlike his father, Liji was younger, more sensitive, and more intellectually inclined. He and Wu shared conversations, subtle, cautious, but meaningful. Wu Zetian made a strong impression. She was intelligent, poised, and unafraid to speak with clarity and confidence. In a palace filled with competition and flattery, her authenticity stood out. Though no formal relationship existed between them at that time, a spark had been lit. One day, this bond would prove to be pivotal. Death and disappearance. In 649 CE, Emperor Taizong died after a long illness. By imperial tradition, any concubine who had not borne the emperor a child was to retire from court life and become a Buddhist nun. This was the empire's way of cleansing the former ruler's presence, both physically and politically. Wu Zetian, like many others, was sent to Ganye Temple, a Buddhist convent on the outskirts of the capital. To most, this seemed like the end of her story. She was 25 years old. She had no children. She had not risen to any significant rank. Now she would spend the rest of her life in religious seclusion, meditating and copying scriptures, forgotten by the world. But Wu Zetian was not most women. She endured the transition, observing the life of the convent as she had once studied the court. She participated in rituals, but never let go of her ambitions. And then, in a twist worthy of a legend, fate opened the door once again. Destiny's unexpected turn. A year after ascending the throne as Emperor Gaozong, Li Ji visited the convent and requested a ceremony at Ganye Temple. There, he saw Wu Zetian again. She was no longer a girl, but a woman, refined, self-possessed, and more compelling than ever. Moved by memory or desire, or perhaps by her formidable presence, he arranged for her return to the palace, this time as his own concubine. It was an extraordinary act, one that shocked the court and enraged his wife, Empress Wang. Bringing back a former concubine of his father was considered scandalous, even perverse. But Gaozong defied custom, and Wu Zetian, once again, entered the Forbidden City. This time, she was ready. She returned not as a servant of the emperor, but as a master of palace politics. She had seen how power worked, and she knew exactly what she wanted. And she would stop at nothing to get it. Wu Zetian, return to power, rise to empress. When Wu Zetian stepped once again through the gates of the Forbidden City, she was not the same girl who had entered it years before as a teenage concubine. Now in her late 20s, she returned at the personal request of Emperor Gaozong, formerly Prince Liji, who remembered her not only for her beauty and intellect, but for the impression she had left on his mind and heart. To the rest of the court, her return was scandalous. She had been the concubine of the late Emperor Taizong, and tradition dictated that she remain in religious seclusion for life. Her reappearance was more than socially unacceptable, it was politically dangerous. But Wu Zetian was not afraid of danger. In fact, she seemed to thrive in it. She had not come back simply to resume a romantic relationship. She had returned with purpose. She had studied the rules of court life, and now she was prepared to rewrite them. The palace's battlefield. Emperor Gaozong welcomed her back warmly, assigning her the title Thou Yi, one of the highest ranks among imperial concubines. But high status did not mean safety. Wu Zetian was entering a palace already filled with powerful women, most notably Empress Wang and consort Xiao, both of whom had their own factions, influence, and political ambitions. Wu quickly recognized that her path to true power would be blocked unless she removed her chief rivals. And so, she began the delicate and dangerous game of court strategy, a game she would eventually master like no woman before or after her. Where others used whispers and alliances, Wu Zetian used intellect, patience, and an almost surgical precision. She never confronted her enemies directly. Instead, she chipped away at their reputations, exposed their weaknesses, and turned their strengths against them, winning the emperor's favor. While the other women of the court competed through flattery, jewelry, and lavish entertainments, Wu Zetian approached the emperor with ideas. She discussed history and government. She offered counsel on domestic affairs. She positioned herself not just as a lover, but as a partner. Gaozong was frequently unwell and often uncertain in his decisions. In Wu Zetian, he found clarity, confidence, and quiet control. He began to depend on her, not just emotionally, but administratively. With each passing month, Wu grew in influence. Ministers began to realize that if they wanted their ideas heard, they needed her blessing. And her rivals noticed, too, the downfall of Empress Wang and consort Xiao. Wu Zetian understood that she couldn't simply challenge Empress Wang or consort Xiao head-on. Both had strong backers in court and long histories with the emperor. Instead, Wu began a whisper campaign, subtle, persistent, and devastating. She highlighted Empress Wang's lack of children, suggesting that the emperor needed a fertile consort to secure his lineage. She exposed consort Xiao's arrogance and manipulation, painting her as a threat to harmony within the palace. Then, fate, or perhaps strategy, delivered Wu Zetian the ultimate weapon. She gave birth to several children, including sons. In the royal court, producing heirs was more than a personal triumph, it was a political statement. Wu Zetian had not only won the emperor's heart, she had secured the future of the dynasty. But what happened next remains one of the most controversial episodes of her life. In 654, Wu Zetian's infant daughter died under mysterious circumstances. Wu accused Empress Wang of murder, a shocking claim, given the empress's high status and lack of motive. Some historians believe Wu herself may have killed the child, using the tragedy as a political trap. Others argue it was a natural death twisted into a weapon. Whatever the truth, the fallout was swift. Gaozong, already leaning toward Wu, now viewed Wang and Xiao with suspicion. Accusations of witchcraft, disloyalty, and conspiracy began to surface. In a dramatic and public fall from grace, both women were stripped of their titles, imprisoned, and eventually executed. With her rivals eliminated, Wu Zetian rose to the highest position a woman could hold, empress consort of the Tang dynasty, an empress with a mind of her own. Unlike her predecessors, Wu Zetian did not see her new title as ceremonial. She was no figurehead, content to bear children and sponsor temples. She intended to rule. Once crowned, she began reshaping the court to suit her vision. She promoted officials based on merit rather than birth, brought scholars and reformers into her inner circle, and began exerting influence over court decisions, even those that traditionally belonged to the emperor. While Gaozong remained the official ruler, it was Wu Zetian who truly steered the empire. Ministers now whispered her name as often as his. She sat behind the curtain during meetings, guiding the emperor's thoughts, drafting decrees, and eliminating opponents who dared question her place in government. What had begun as an affair had become a regime, rewriting the order of things. Wu Zetian's rise to empress marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had fought, strategized, and outwitted her way into power, but she was far from done. Her reign would grow even more formidable, her control more absolute, and her legacy more controversial in the years to come. But in those early days as empress, one thing became undeniably clear: the woman once dismissed as a minor concubine had become the most powerful force in the Tang court, and China would never be the same again. Wu Zetian, the power behind the throne. As the years passed, Emperor Gaozong's health began to decline, casting a shadow over the Tang dynasty's grand court. What might have been a time of uncertainty for the empire instead became a defining moment for Wu Zetian, once a low-ranking concubine, now the de facto ruler of the most powerful empire in the world. Her ascent to actual power was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the result of years of patient strategy, political savvy, and unwavering determination. With Gaozong increasingly debilitated by chronic illness, Wu Zetian stepped forward to shoulder the heavy burdens of governance, demonstrating skills that few had expected from a woman in her position. A new role emerges. Though Gaozong remained the official emperor, the real command of the empire gradually shifted into Wu Zetian's hands. She was no longer confined to the inner chambers of the palace or the limited role of consort. Instead, she became a central figure in the administration, attending court meetings, making policy decisions, and directing the complex machinery of imperial governance. Her influence was not just symbolic, it was substantive and sweeping. Wu Zetian showed remarkable aptitude for leadership. She understood the delicate balance between tradition and reform, authority and flexibility. She worked closely with ministers and generals, often outmaneuvering established officials whose loyalty to the emperor did not always extend to her. Her decisions ranged from domestic reforms aimed at stabilizing the empire, to diplomatic efforts that preserved and expanded Tang influence across Asia. Mastering domestic policy. One of Wu Zetian's earliest achievements as a ruler-in-waiting was to overhaul the imperial bureaucracy. She was deeply aware that the Tang government's strength depended on its officials' competence and loyalty. To that end, she encouraged meritocracy, promoting talented but previously overlooked scholars and administrators from humble backgrounds. She reinstated the civil service examinations, a rigorous testing system designed to select officials based on intellectual ability rather than aristocratic birthright. This reform widened the pool of government talent, bringing fresh energy and innovation into the administration. It also helped weaken the entrenched aristocracy that often resisted change and clung to privileges. Wu Zetian's reforms went beyond staffing. She invested in agricultural development, recognizing that a strong food supply was the backbone of social stability and economic prosperity. She implemented policies that improved irrigation and land distribution, helping farmers increase production and, by extension, the state's revenue. Foreign affairs and military strategy. Wu Zetian's influence extended far beyond the palace walls. She was actively involved in managing the empire's foreign relations, especially in a period marked by shifting alliances and border conflicts. Under her guidance, the Tang military undertook successful campaigns that expanded Chinese influence into Central Asia and the Korean Peninsula. She skillfully balanced diplomacy with displays of military strength, securing trade routes and political alliances that benefited the empire. Her ability to coordinate these efforts demonstrated not just political savvy, but a strategic mind attuned to the complex realities of empire building. Challenges and opposition. Despite her growing power, Wu Zetian faced persistent opposition. Many courtiers and nobles refused to accept the authority of a woman, especially one who had once been a mere concubine. She was criticized for breaking with Confucian ideals that emphasized male leadership and female submission. Her enemies accused her of manipulating the emperor and undermining traditional values. But Wu Zetian was adept at navigating these challenges. She built a network of loyal supporters within the court and among the military. She employed intelligence networks to monitor dissent and quickly neutralize threats. Her rule was often described as ruthless, but it was also effective, pragmatic, and visionary. The emperor's shadow. Gaozong's health continued to deteriorate, and in many ways, Wu Zetian became the emperor in all but name. She presided over imperial audiences, issued edicts, and controlled appointments at the highest levels of government. The emperor himself seemed content to allow her this authority. Whether out of genuine trust, physical incapacity, or political calculation, Gaozong gradually ceded the reins of power. Wu Zetian's position was unprecedented. She was not yet officially the ruler, but her authority was absolute. Her name was whispered in the halls of power, her decisions shaped the destiny of millions, and the empire turned increasingly on her will. The quiet architect of an empire. This period of de facto rule set the stage for Wu Zetian's eventual unprecedented step, declaring herself emperor in her own right. But before that historic moment, she honed her skills in the shadows of the throne, learning how to balance power, perception, and policy. Her governance style combined strict discipline with innovative reforms. She embraced Buddhism as a source of political legitimacy, using religion to justify her authority and rally support. Her court became a center of culture and learning, encouraging poets, artists, and scholars. Under her guidance, the Tang dynasty experienced a remarkable flowering of civilization even amidst political upheaval. Legacy of the power behind the throne. Wu Zetian's tenure as the power behind Emperor Gaozong's throne marked a dramatic transformation in Chinese history. She shattered centuries-old norms about gender and governance, proving that a woman could not only participate in but dominate imperial politics. Her leadership brought stability to a vulnerable empire, revitalized government institutions, and expanded China's influence across Asia. Though controversial, her rule showcased a unique blend of intelligence, resilience, and strategic brilliance. Even centuries later, Wu Zetian remains one of history's most fascinating figures, a woman who rose from obscurity to command an empire, ruling from behind the throne with a hand both firm and visionary. Wu Zetian, Empress Dowager and Regent, the true power behind the throne. The death of Emperor Gaozong in 683 marked a critical turning point in the history of the Tang dynasty, and for Wu Zetian herself. Though her husband was gone, her grip on power tightened, and her influence reached heights no woman in Chinese history had ever seen. Traditionally, after an emperor's death, the throne would pass to his designated heir. In this case, Wu Zetian's son succeeded Gaozong in rapid succession. Yet, behind the facade of imperial authority, it was Wu Zetian who remained the true ruler of China. As Empress Dowager and Regent, she commanded the empire's political machinery with unparalleled mastery. The role of Empress Dowager. In the hierarchical world of Imperial China, the title of Empress Dowager carried great prestige but did not automatically grant governing authority. Usually, an Empress Dowager acted as a respected matriarch and advisor, particularly when the new emperor was young or inexperienced. But Wu Zetian transformed this role into one of absolute control. Her sons, while officially emperors, were young and politically inexperienced. This provided her the opportunity, and the excuse, to govern as regent, claiming she acted in their best interests and in the empire's. Her authority was not challenged easily. She surrounded herself with loyal ministers and palace officials who ensured her edicts were carried out without question. She skillfully managed palace factions, sidelining rivals and consolidating power so that every decision passed through her. Palace politics and power play. Wu Zetian's time as Empress Dowager was marked by intense political maneuvering. The imperial court was rife with intrigue, as nobles, generals, and ministers vied for favor and influence. But Wu Zetian was a master strategist. She used intelligence networks and spies to keep close watch on her enemies. Those who dared oppose her often disappeared from the political scene, whether through exile, demotion, or more sinister means. Her approach to governance combined ruthless pragmatism with visionary reforms. She understood that to maintain power, she had to control not only the emperor but also the bureaucracy, the military, and the religious institutions. Ensuring the succession. One of Wu Zetian's most critical tasks was securing her family's hold on the throne. Her sons, although emperors by title, were largely figureheads under her direction. Wu Zetian orchestrated marriages, appointments, and alliances to strengthen her family's position. She kept potential rivals at bay, ensuring that no one threatened her line of succession. At the same time, she continued to strengthen her own personal authority, preparing the ground for an unprecedented move, her own ascension as emperor. Balancing tradition and innovation. While she wielded absolute power, Wu Zetian remained keenly aware of the delicate balance between tradition and change. She upheld many Confucian rituals and imperial customs, understanding their importance in legitimizing her rule. Yet, she also pushed boundaries. She promoted Buddhism as a political tool, using its moral authority to justify her unprecedented role as a female ruler. She commissioned grand temples and statues, linking her reign to divine favor. Her administration continued reforms begun during Gaozong's illness, improving the civil service, strengthening the economy, and expanding cultural patronage. A legacy of power and controversy. Wu Zetian's regency was a period of both consolidation and transformation. Her ability to control the empire's vast apparatus set the stage for her historic declaration as emperor in her own right, a bold move that would forever change the course of Chinese history. Yet, her reign was also marked by controversy. Traditional historians often painted her as a usurper, criticizing her ruthlessness and unorthodox methods. But modern scholarship recognizes her as a complex figure, a brilliant strategist, a reformer, and a woman who transcended the limits placed on her gender. As Empress Dowager and Regent, Wu Zetian was the ultimate embodiment of power, wielding it quietly but decisively, ensuring that the empire's fate was firmly in her hands. Wu Zetian, the founding of a new dynasty. By the late 7th century, Wu Zetian had already surpassed every woman in Chinese history in terms of political power. She had risen from a concubine to empress consort, from regent to the unchallenged authority behind the throne. But in the year 690 CE, Wu Zetian would go even further, breaking through every barrier of tradition, history, and patriarchy. That year, she officially declared the end of the Tang dynasty. In its place, she established a new imperial house, the Zhou dynasty, and declared herself the Holy and Divine Emperor. It was a move that stunned the empire and rewrote the rules of Imperial China. For the first and only time in its thousands of years of history, a woman had claimed the dragon throne in her own name, not as the wife or mother of a ruler, but as Emperor of China in her own right. A calculated revolution. Wu Zetian did not take this step lightly. It was the culmination of decades of political maneuvering, consolidation of power, and deep insight into the psychology of rule. By 690, she was already acting as the empire's true ruler. But to transform that unofficial authority into a formal title, she had to first build consensus, or at least remove opposition. She did this with careful planning. Using her vast network of spies and informants, she monitored court sentiment. She ensured her most loyal supporters were placed in strategic positions throughout the government and military. And she used religion, especially Buddhism, as a potent source of legitimacy. Buddhist scholars had begun promoting the idea of a female monarch based on spiritual texts and prophecy. One particularly useful prophecy spoke of a divine ruler, a woman who would bring peace and order to the world. Wu Zetian encouraged these interpretations, allowing her to frame her rise not as ambition, but as destiny. The fall of the Tang, the rise of Zhou. With her base of support secured, Wu Zetian moved quickly. She forced her son, then Emperor Thongzong, to abdicate. Rather than naming another male relative to take his place, she abolished the Tang altogether and announced the birth of a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, borrowing the name from one of China's ancient golden ages. She took on the title Shengshen Huangdi, Holy and Divine Emperor, elevating herself above even traditional male rulers. Her court ceremonials, robes, and decrees all reflected her unique status, not as a female ruler substituting for a man, but as an emperor in full command of heaven's mandate. The shock to the Confucian establishment was immense. Never before had a woman sat on the dragon throne. But resistance was quickly silenced. Those who opposed her found themselves demoted, exiled, or eliminated. To the people of the empire, Wu Zetian framed her new rule as a continuation of order and prosperity, not a break from it. She maintained many Tang institutions, but under the new Zhou name. It was both radical and cautious, a bold revolution hidden beneath a veneer of stability. Reforming the empire as emperor. Now ruling as emperor, Wu Zetian continued to build on her earlier reforms. She expanded the civil service examination system, further opening the government to talented individuals from non-aristocratic backgrounds. This move not only improved the quality of her bureaucracy but also helped diminish the power of entrenched noble families that might threaten her rule. She invested heavily in agriculture, infrastructure, and taxation reform. Her administration encouraged economic development, redistributed land to increase farming productivity, and oversaw the construction of granaries and irrigation systems. Wu Zetian also promoted education, scholarship, and the arts. She sponsored the writing of official histories and encouraged Buddhist texts to be translated and distributed. Her court became a center for culture and learning, rivaling any previous dynasty in sophistication and ambition. Image and legacy management. Wu Zetian was acutely aware of the importance of image. As a female emperor, she had to project not just strength, but legitimacy. She commissioned massive statues of the Buddha, one of which was said to be modeled on her own face. She ordered the construction of grand temples, used ritual to reinforce her divine mandate, and even altered official documents to emphasize her divine role as a ruler chosen by the heavens. At the same time, she implemented one of the earliest versions of a secret police, rooting out conspiracies and dissent. Her reign, though effective, was undeniably authoritarian. Loyalty was rewarded, but perceived disloyalty could be deadly. And yet, her policies kept the empire stable, prosperous, and secure. Trade flourished along the Silk Road. China's borders were defended. The peasantry was largely cared for, and the elite class, though under scrutiny, continued to benefit from the empire's wealth. Rewriting history. Wu Zetian's founding of the Zhou dynasty remains one of the most dramatic and unprecedented acts in world history. In a rigidly patriarchal society, she not only survived but dominated. Her reign questioned and redefined the very foundation of Chinese political and cultural norms. Historians in the centuries that followed would often judge her harshly, calling her power-hungry, ruthless, even immoral. Much of this was shaped by Confucian writers who saw her rise as a disruption to the natural order. But modern historians offer a different view. Wu Zetian was not an aberration, but a visionary. She ruled with intelligence, purpose, and results. Her achievements rivaled those of many male emperors, and her administrative reforms shaped Chinese governance for generations to come. Her declaration as emperor was not just a personal victory, it was a statement that power, vision, and leadership were not confined by gender. Wu Zetian, governance and control, the emperor's mastery of the empire. By the time Wu Zetian declared herself emperor of the newly founded Zhou dynasty in 690 CE, she had already shattered centuries of tradition. But claiming the throne was only the beginning. What followed was a rule marked by intense reform, centralized control, and a deep reimagining of governance. Wu Zetian wasn't just China's only female emperor, she was also one of its most effective rulers. Her reign brought political stability, economic growth, and a renewed sense of order to a nation often destabilized by aristocratic infighting and succession disputes. But she ruled with both vision and vigilance. Reform and repression went hand in hand. To build an empire that could withstand resistance to her gender and her audacity, she had to govern not just boldly, but absolutely. Meritocracy over aristocracy. One of Wu Zetian's most radical and lasting reforms was her challenge to the power of the aristocracy. For centuries, Imperial China had been dominated by noble families who treated high office as their birthright. Wu Zetian knew that if she wanted to maintain authority, she would need a new class of loyal, competent officials, people whose success depended on her favor, not their lineage. To achieve this, she expanded the imperial examination system, a civil service entrance exam originally designed to recruit talented men into government. Under her reign, the exams became more inclusive and rigorous, allowing men from lower social classes to rise through the ranks based on intellect and achievement rather than family connections. This strategy not only increased the quality of the imperial bureaucracy, but also helped her dismantle rival power bases. Many of her top administrators were men who owed everything to her, creating a loyal administrative elite with little interest in restoring the aristocratic order. Restructuring the bureaucracy. Wu Zetian didn't stop at recruitment. She reorganized the structure of the imperial court, streamlining government operations and increasing her oversight. She introduced new government departments, promoted transparency in accounting and logistics, and ensured that local officials were regularly reviewed. She was known to personally read reports from provinces and gave direct feedback, an almost unheard of level of involvement for an emperor. This tight grip on bureaucracy allowed her to deliver on policy promises, such as equitable taxation and agricultural support. It also meant that she could reward loyalty and punish corruption swiftly, reinforcing a culture of competence and caution within the government. Agricultural prosperity and economic growth. Wu Zetian understood that the foundation of any empire was the peasantry. While emperors before her had often focused on grand military campaigns or court splendor, she directed resources toward agriculture and rural development. Her administration promoted land redistribution in favor of small farmers, repaired and expanded irrigation systems, and built granaries to prevent famine during poor harvests. These policies not only increased food security but also boosted morale and productivity among the empire's rural majority. By stabilizing the countryside and ensuring that peasants had access to land and food, Wu Zetian strengthened the empire's tax base and ensured long-term economic health, further legitimizing her rule in the eyes of common people. The machinery of surveillance and suppression. But prosperity came with a price. Wu Zetian knew that her position as a woman in power would always be fragile in the eyes of her enemies. To secure her reign, she built an extensive network of secret police and informants. This internal security system monitored not only provincial governors and court officials but even members of the royal family. Plots, both real and imagined, were exposed with chilling efficiency. Suspected traitors were quickly arrested, interrogated, and, in many cases, executed. The climate of fear kept open rebellion at bay. But it also fostered an atmosphere of paranoia. Friends betrayed friends, ministers watched one another, and whispers could become accusations. Historians debate the extent of her brutality. Some claim she relied heavily on torture and false accusations to remove rivals. Others argue that her tactics, while harsh, were not unusual for rulers of the time, male or female, and that they were necessary to hold together an empire in transition. What cannot be denied is that Wu Zetian's surveillance state worked. For over a decade, her rule remained unchallenged by large-scale rebellion or coup attempts, a rare achievement in any dynasty. Balancing reform and fear. Wu Zetian's reign was a careful dance between benevolence and force. She offered opportunity and prosperity with one hand and held firm control with the other. She patronized the arts and education. She protected the rights of commoners. She elevated Buddhism as the state's moral backbone. But behind the idealism was an iron will. Governance, in her eyes, was not about appeasement. It was about effectiveness. For her, the end, stability, prosperity, and the continuation of her dynasty justified the means. An empire transformed. Under Wu Zetian, China saw not only an expansion of opportunity but also a transformation in the very idea of power. She proved that effective governance could come from outside the male aristocracy. She showed that order and reform were not the birthright of noble families but the result of strategic planning, inclusive policies, and strong leadership. And while her critics would long accuse her of cruelty and ambition, they could not ignore the results. The roads were safe. The granaries were full. The empire was at peace. This was the China Wu Zetian ruled, a nation forged through merit, maintained through vigilance, and led by a woman who refused to be anything less than emperor. Wu Zetian, the sunset of an empire, final years and forced abdication. By the dawn of the 8th century, Wu Zetian's remarkable reign was nearing its end. She had accomplished what no woman in Chinese history had before or has since, ruled as emperor in her own right. Her power had been absolute, her reforms sweeping, and her authority unmatched for decades. But time, as ever, proved a formidable adversary. In her final years, Wu was no longer the iron-willed reformer who had dominated court politics with brilliance and precision. Now elderly and in declining health, she began to withdraw from the everyday rigors of governance. In her place rose two figures who would ultimately contribute to the unraveling of her hard-won legacy, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changsong, brothers whose charm and attentiveness won the empress's affection, but whose presence deeply disturbed the elite ruling class. The rise of the Zhang brothers. The Zhang brothers entered the court not through political acumen, but by capturing the personal interest of the aging empress. They were young, charismatic, and attentive, qualities Wu Zetian, increasingly isolated and frail, likely found both comforting and useful. At first, their roles seemed minor, confined to personal service and ceremonial duties, but gradually, they began to wield real influence. They acted as intermediaries, controlled access to the empress, and influenced appointments and decisions. Their proximity to power made them gatekeepers of the empire's inner circle. Many saw them as unqualified opportunists, parasites feeding off the twilight of an emperor's reign. To Wu, however, they were loyal and effective assistants. And perhaps more importantly, they filled an emotional void. With many of her earlier allies dead, exiled, or sidelined, the Zhang brothers were among the few who remained personally devoted to her. Court resentment and political tensions, but their ascent came at a cost. The traditional nobility, Confucian scholars, and military officials bristled at the brothers' influence. These powerful factions had long tolerated Wu Zetian's rule out of fear or grudging respect. Now, seeing her dependent on two seemingly frivolous courtiers, they sensed vulnerability. Their resentment simmered in silence at first, masked behind polite rituals and ceremonial obedience. But beneath the surface, plots were forming. The once stable court was now split, between those loyal to the empress, those resentful of her favorites, and those eager to restore the Tang dynasty by any means necessary. Even Wu Zetian's own family began to waver. Her sons, long relegated to the background, grew increasingly restless. Many among the nobility believed it was time to return to the Tang lineage and end the Zhou interregnum, especially now that the empress seemed no longer fit to govern. The coup of 705. The end came swiftly. In early 705 CE, a coalition of court officials and military officers, most notably Zhang Junzi, a senior minister loyal to the Tang cause, launched a palace coup. The conspirators stormed the imperial quarters in the pre-dawn hours, eliminating the Zhang brothers and surrounding the empress's private chambers. There was no great battle. No call to arms or dramatic defense. Wu Zetian, now around 80 years old, understood what was happening. The empire she had carved through strategy, boldness, and ruthless calculation was being pulled from her grasp, not by a rival state, but by the very institution she had once reshaped in her image. Faced with overwhelming force and betrayal from within, she abdicated peacefully, passing the throne to her son, Li Shen, who had once been removed from power during her earlier regency. He now reclaimed the imperial name as Emperor Thongzong of Tang, signaling the official end of the Zhou dynasty and the restoration of the Tang. Grace in exit, silence in legacy. In the months following her abdication, Wu Zetian lived in relative quiet in the Shanyang Palace, watched over but not imprisoned. While some of her supporters were purged from the court, she was treated with a degree of reverence, perhaps out of recognition for her years of rule, or simply because her removal had been achieved so cleanly. She died later that year, in December 705 CE. Her tombstone, notably, was left blank, a silence that spoke volumes. It reflected both the controversy of her reign and the uncertainty about how to summarize such a life. Her successors, particularly those loyal to the Tang restoration, attempted to erase her legacy, restoring the official history to emphasize the legitimacy of the Tang and marginalize her role. A woman who redefined power. But history proved difficult to silence. Despite the Tang court's efforts to minimize her legacy, Wu Zetian remained a subject of fascination and debate across generations. To her detractors, she was a tyrant, ambitious to a fault, ruthless, and immoral. They pointed to the executions, the secret police, and the Zhang brothers as evidence of a ruler who lost her way. To her defenders, she was a pioneer who broke the shackles of gender in a fiercely patriarchal society. She opened the civil service to men of lower status, championed competent governance, and presided over one of the most stable periods of the Tang era. In either reading, Wu Zetian was extraordinary. Her ability to not only survive, but thrive, in a political system stacked against her remains a testament to her intelligence, resilience, and vision. Her fall was not the result of failure, but of time, a transition that every ruler eventually faces. The final word. Wu Zetian's story is one of audacity and complexity. From her entry into the court as a teenage concubine to her reign as emperor, and finally, Her quiet exit, she challenged everything about what leadership looked like in Imperial China. She rose in a world that told her she had no place in power, and built a dynasty of her own. She governed with wisdom and fear, lifted the humble, and punished the proud. And when her time ended, she left behind a country she had transformed. Centuries later, her tomb still stands at the Qianling Mausoleum, its blank stele whispering the truth that no words could contain her story. Wu Zetian, legacy of an empress. When Wu Zetian died in 705 CE, her long and revolutionary reign came to a quiet close. But her story was far from over. In the years that followed, imperial historians, most of them men loyal to the re-established Tang dynasty, began crafting a narrative meant to contain her legacy. They wrote of her ruthlessness, her use of spies, her manipulation of the imperial court. They fixated on her personal life, on the Zhang brothers, on her rivals who died under mysterious circumstances, on her breach of traditional gender roles. But history, as it turns out, is not so easily tamed. Centuries later, modern scholars and thinkers would revisit the life of Wu Zetian with new eyes, seeing not just a woman who ruled with power, but a woman who changed the very meaning of power in ancient China, erasing a dynasty, preserving a legend. Immediately after her death, Tang loyalists acted quickly to restore continuity. Wu's brief Zhou dynasty was officially erased from dynastic records. Her name was often left out or replaced in temple titles, and later Confucian historians painted her as an unnatural ruler, a woman who dared to sit on a man's throne. Her innovations and reforms were quietly rebranded as the achievements of later Tang emperors. The civil service system she expanded, restored and credited to her sons. The Buddhist symbolism she wielded to claim legitimacy, dismissed as superstition or political theater. And her own tomb, marked by a blank stele, stood as a metaphor for the attempt to silence her voice. Yet despite all of this, Wu Zetian was never truly forgotten. Her name continued to provoke fascination. Secretly admired by some, feared by others, she lingered in folklore, operas, paintings, and unofficial chronicles. Her legacy, though distorted, remained undeniably powerful. A modern reassessment. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians began re-evaluating Wu Zetian's reign through new lenses: feminist theory, political strategy, meritocratic reform, and statecraft. They found a leader who had reshaped China's imperial bureaucracy, replacing aristocratic privilege with examinations and promotions based on talent. She appointed competent officials regardless of their social background, an early step toward a more inclusive government system. Wu also strengthened the role of the state in agriculture and infrastructure, laying foundations for a more resilient economy. Rather than a mere tyrant, she emerged as a savvy and forward-thinking ruler, balancing reform with control, tradition with innovation. And perhaps most importantly, she governed successfully. Under her rule, the empire was stable, prosperous, and secure. She defended its borders, negotiated with foreign powers, and maintained the loyalty of her people, no small feat for any ruler, male or female. Gender, power, and perception. Much of the negative portrayal of Wu Zetian can be traced not just to her policies or methods, but to the fact that she was a woman in a role traditionally reserved for men. In Confucian China, female leadership was not merely rare, it was seen as an aberration. Wu knew this. She worked tirelessly to construct legitimacy, often through religious and symbolic means. She aligned herself with Buddhist prophecy, presenting herself as the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. This spiritual narrative allowed her to justify her rule in terms the public could accept, even if the elite chafed under her authority. But modern scholars recognize that much of the critique directed at Wu was gendered. Many of the same actions, decisiveness, ambition, elimination of rivals, were praised in male rulers but condemned in her. The double standard was clear, and it colored the way she was remembered for over 1,000 years. Today, she is increasingly viewed as a case study in how societies treat powerful women, and how those women must often work twice as hard to be taken seriously, only to be remembered with suspicion or disdain. A symbol for the ages. Wu Zetian's legacy has undergone a remarkable evolution. In Chinese popular culture, she is now a fixture in historical dramas, novels, and films. Some portray her as a tragic heroine, others as a cunning villain, and still others as a proto-feminist icon. Each interpretation says as much about the society doing the remembering as it does about Wu herself. In academia, she is often cited in discussions of female leadership, authoritarian governance, and dynastic transition. Political scientists examine her consolidation of power, while gender studies scholars explore the unique pressures she faced as a woman in command. Even in the West, where her name was once obscure, Wu Zetian has begun to earn recognition as one of history's most formidable rulers. She is increasingly compared to figures like Cleopatra, Elizabeth I, or Catherine the Great, not just for her gender, but for her ability to wield power effectively in patriarchal systems. The blank stele speaks. Perhaps the greatest symbol of Wu Zetian's complex legacy is her tombstone, which bears no inscription. Some say she chose this herself, that no words could adequately capture her life, her ambitions, her triumphs and compromises. Others believe it was an act of erasure, a final insult by those who wanted to reduce her to silence. But today, that blank stele is read differently. It is no longer seen as empty. Instead, it has become a canvas, a space for ongoing debate, reinterpretation, and admiration. In a way, it is the most honest memorial a ruler like Wu Zetian could have. Not a fixed narrative, but an open question. Not a verdict, but an invitation to remember and rethink. A final thought. Wu Zetian did not simply rule. She challenged every expectation of what a ruler could be. She rose from concubinage to command the largest empire on earth. She did it in a world built to exclude her. She did it with vision, intelligence, and a brutal sense of necessity. And though the men who followed her tried to bury her legacy, they could not. Her story survived, rising again, like the phoenix she once used as her imperial emblem. Wu Zetian remains a woman of contradiction, ruthless yet reforming, feared yet admired, forgotten yet unforgettable. And that, my friends, is the incredible, ruthless, and unforgettable journey of Wu Zetian, the concubine who became emperor, and the woman who changed Chinese history forever. Love her or fear her, one thing's for sure, you'll never forget her. If you enjoyed this wild ride through palace intrigue, political genius, and imperial ambition, don't forget to hit that like button and smash subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the most jaw-dropping stories from history. This is Thunga's Story Time, where the past is anything but boring. Drop a comment below, who should we cover next? Another empress? A forgotten rebel? A genius lost to time? Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and keep questioning the stories you thought you knew. See you in the next chapter. Imagine a world where your morning doesn't start with coffee, but with a deep bow to your ancestors. A world where what you wear, eat, and even think is controlled by a system that sees you more as a tool than a person. Welcome to feudal China, one of history's most fascinating yet fearsome civilizations. This isn't your average history lesson. We're diving into the real, raw, and often brutal lives behind the silk curtains and stone walls. From genius inventions to ruthless punishments, arranged marriages to secret palace plots, this story has it all. If you think you know what ancient China was like, think again. I'm Thunga, and this is Story Time, where history gets personal. Let's begin. Waking up in feudal China, duty before desire. Imagine opening your eyes not to the buzz of an alarm clock, but to the soft rustle of bamboo leaves in the morning breeze. There's no choice to sleep in, no time to stretch and yawn. Your day begins with obligation, not to yourself, but to others, to your parents, to your ancestors, and to a rigid social system that has already decided who you are and who you'll be. This was life in feudal China, a land of majestic emperors, elegant poetry, breathtaking inventions, and overwhelming control. A civilization admired for its contributions to the world, yet bound by layers of tradition, hierarchy, and duty. In this world, individual freedom was not only rare, it was often viewed as a threat. Society set in stone, the social pyramid. At the very top of this towering social order sat the emperor, known as the Son of Heaven. His rule was absolute, believed to be divinely ordained. No law existed above his word, no higher power to question him, except, perhaps, the mandate of heaven, a philosophical concept that justified rebellion if an emperor failed morally or politically. Directly beneath him were the scholar officials, men who had passed grueling state examinations in Confucian philosophy. They weren't just bureaucrats, they were moral authorities, educated elites who advised the emperor and enforced the laws of the land. Their high status came not from wealth, but from intellectual achievement and supposed ethical superiority. Then came the peasants, hard-working farmers who toiled from dawn to dusk to feed the empire. Unlike in some other ancient societies, Chinese peasants were respected in principle. After all, they produced food, the most basic necessity of life. But make no mistake, their lives were anything but easy. Many lived in poverty, burdened by taxes, droughts, and the ever-present threat of conscription or forced labor on imperial projects. Beneath the peasants were the artisans and craftsmen. They made tools, furniture, pottery, and other goods essential to daily life. Their work was skilled and valuable, but they didn't hold much social prestige. Even lower in social respect, though often wealthier, were the merchants. Why? Because Confucian thought regarded them with suspicion. Merchants were seen as parasites, they didn't produce anything, they only bought and sold for profit. In a system that prized morality, humility, and service, profit-seeking was frowned upon. The bottom rungs, the disregarded and the disempowered. At the very bottom of the social ladder were those considered socially tainted or morally impure. This included soldiers, despite their importance to national defense. It also included domestic servants, actors, musicians, prostitutes, criminals, and others who were seen as existing outside the moral or productive structure of society. Women, regardless of class, occupied a consistently subordinate role. Whether born into nobility or a farming family, a woman's identity was tied to the men in her life: her father, her husband, her sons. Confucian teachings emphasized the three obediences. A woman was expected to obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her sons in widowhood. Freedom? Autonomy? These were luxuries few could imagine, especially if you were born female. Your place was not a choice, it was your fate. In this deeply hierarchical world, social mobility was possible, but rare. If you were born a peasant, chances were high that you would die a peasant. The primary path upward was through the civil service examination system, but passing these tests required years of study, and money for tutors and time away from work. Most couldn't afford the luxury of learning Confucian classics by candlelight. What mattered more than your dreams was your duty, to your family, your ancestors, your emperor, and your role in society. You were not an individual in the modern sense. You were a part of a whole, a cog in the grand machine of the empire. Even at birth, your destiny was dictated by your class, your gender, and your family's fortune or failure. Why it matters today. Feudal China lasted for over 2 millennia. Its strict social codes and enduring traditions helped maintain order across an enormous and diverse empire. But this order came at a cost: stifled potential, gender oppression, and harsh inequalities. The story of this era is a reminder that cultural brilliance can coexist with deep injustice, and that while traditions can bind a society together, they can also prevent it from evolving. Understanding feudal China means looking beyond the stunning calligraphy and majestic palaces. It means seeing the millions of ordinary people who lived within its system, not as emperors, but as farmers, craftsmen, servants, and silent daughters. Rituals before breakfast, the sacred duty of respect. In feudal China, daily life was not just about survival, it was about reverence. From the moment one awoke, the day unfolded not according to personal preference or spontaneity, but according to custom, order, and obligation. Central to this structure was the unshakable principle of filial piety, the Confucian ideal that shaped every household, every generation, and every action. Forget to honor your ancestors? Disobey your parents? That wasn't simply rude, it was considered a moral failing, even a sin. The morning begins with a bow. For children, the day did not start with a yawn or play, it began on their knees. Literally. Each morning, before eating or even speaking freely, they were expected to bow deeply to their parents and grandparents. Often, this ritual would be repeated 3 or more times, a physical act meant to express submission, loyalty, and gratitude. In wealthier households, this might take place in front of a formal altar in the main hall. In humble homes, it could be as simple as kneeling on the packed earth floor beside the family hearth. Regardless of setting, the meaning was sacred. This was not a gesture done out of habit or fear, it was woven into the moral DNA of the culture. Children were taught from their earliest days that they owed everything to those who came before them. Life itself was a gift from their ancestors, and it was to be repaid with absolute respect. Ancestor worship, the heart of the home. In every home, from mud brick cottages to palace chambers, there was a space set aside for the ancestors. Often, it was a small shrine or table with wooden name tablets, painted portraits, or incense holders. Here, family members would burn incense, offer bowls of rice or tea, and silently communicate with those who had passed on. The belief was that ancestors continued to watch over the family, protecting them from illness, misfortune, or failure. If they were honored properly, they would bless the household. If neglected, they might bring curses or bad luck. Ancestor worship was not optional. It was a spiritual contract, a two-way relationship that tied the living to the dead in a loop of memory, obligation, and reverence. Respect was a daily practice, not a holiday. While modern Americans might associate family traditions with holidays like Thanksgiving or religious observances, in feudal China, these practices were part of daily life. Respect wasn't reserved for special occasions, it was expected at every meal, every greeting, every decision. Sons were taught to obey without question. Daughters, in particular, were raised to be gentle, quiet, and ever mindful of how their behavior reflected on the family's honor. Even tone of voice mattered. Speaking too loudly or using the wrong posture could be interpreted as disrespect. These weren't just personal choices, they were measures of moral character. Food and ritual intertwined. Before meals, especially in traditional families, a small portion of food might be set aside for the ancestors. The act wasn't just symbolic, it was seen as real nourishment offered to the spirits of the departed. Only after this gesture was complete could the family begin to eat. Meals themselves were often eaten in strict silence, or with only subdued conversation. The eldest male would eat first, followed by others in descending order of age and status. Children didn't speak unless spoken to. Laughing loudly at the table? A serious breach of etiquette. Even the act of passing food had to be done with 2 hands, as a mark of politeness. When respect wasn't shown, social and legal consequences. Disrespecting one's parents wasn't just frowned upon, it could have legal consequences. Confucian ideals were deeply embedded in law. In many dynasties, striking a parent or grandparent was a criminal offense that could lead to public punishment, exile, or even execution. In one infamous historical case, a young man who raised his voice at his mother in public was beaten and paraded through the streets as a warning to others. His crime? Failing in his filial duties. Even within the home, the consequences could be just as serious. A child who dishonored the family might be disinherited, sent away, or permanently shamed. In many families, honor was everything. Lose it, and you might as well be dead. Filial piety as a social glue. Why was this system so powerful? Because it worked. Filial piety created stability. It ensured that younger generations cared for the old, upheld family values, and preserved traditions across centuries. In a society without modern welfare systems or retirement plans, family was the only safety net, and that net was built on obedience, loyalty, and ritual. It also reinforced the broader social hierarchy. Just as children were expected to submit to their parents, citizens were expected to submit to the emperor, soldiers to generals, wives to husbands. It was a system of merit obedience, from the household to the empire, a legacy that still echoes. Even today, echoes of these traditions remain in Chinese culture, through ancestral festivals, family hierarchies, and expectations of respect for elders. But in feudal China, these weren't simply cultural choices, they were moral imperatives, daily acts of devotion that shaped identity, behavior, and belief. For Americans raised with values of independence and individualism, it may be difficult to imagine a world where personal feelings were always second to family duty. But in feudal China, what you wanted mattered less than who you owed. And every morning, before the sun had fully risen, that truth was expressed in a humble bow to the ones who came before. Simple meals in a strict world, eating in feudal China. After the morning rituals of bows and incense, families in feudal China moved on to the next act of the day, breakfast. But don't picture bacon, eggs, or steaming stacks of pancakes. In this world, breakfast, and most meals, were about survival, not indulgence. Food was simple, repetitive, and dictated by necessity rather than flavor. This was not a time of choice, variety, or abundance for most. It was a time of scarcity, modesty, and humility at the table. The humble start, thin rice porridge. The most common breakfast across much of China was congee, a watery rice porridge, barely more than a handful of grains boiled down in water. It was filling, warm, and easy to digest, but rarely satisfying in the way Americans might think of breakfast. There were no toppings, no sweeteners, no bacon on the side. At best, you might find a pinch of salt, a bit of fermented bean paste, or a few slices of pickled vegetables added to the bowl. Occasionally, if the family had them, bits of dried tofu or green onion might be mixed in. But for most peasants and laborers, the congee was just plain, a quiet, bland beginning to a long day of labor. And yet, this meal was treated with the same respect as a banquet. Meals were never casual. They were quiet, disciplined, and often ritualized. Meat, the rare guest at the table. For the majority of the population, meat was a luxury, not a staple. It might be served a few times a year, during religious festivals, weddings, or the celebration of a successful harvest. On those days, it was shared among many, small portions stretched to feed large extended families. If you were a farmer or laborer, your daily protein might come from soybeans, tofu, or scraps of dried fish. Chickens were kept more for eggs than for meat. Pigs, if a family could raise one, were often saved for special occasions, or sold for cash. Only the wealthy elite, scholar officials, and nobles could afford regular servings of pork, duck, or beef. And even then, moderation was the norm. There were no buffets or belly-stuffing feasts. A dignified meal was not about quantity, but about control, order, and balance. Tea, more medicine than pleasure. One thing nearly everyone drank was tea, not as a luxury or a social drink, but out of practical necessity. Water sources were often contaminated, especially in rural areas or near cities. Boiling water was essential to avoid illness, and tea leaves added a touch of flavor and mild antiseptic qualities. So even the poorest families might keep a small pouch of tea leaves, used sparingly, steeped multiple times. It wasn't about enjoying the aroma or savoring the taste. It was about staying alive. In wealthier homes, tea rituals were more refined. Guests were served with special cups, steeped leaves were admired, and tea culture became an art form. But in the average village, tea was boiled, sipped quickly, and appreciated mostly for what it prevented: dysentery, parasites, and worse, a culture of restraint and routine. The simplicity of food in feudal China was more than just economic, it was cultural. Confucianism emphasized moderation, discipline, and humility. Overeating was seen as indulgent, even immoral. Eating was not for pleasure but for function, to sustain the body so it could serve the family, the ancestors, and the empire. Children were expected to wait for their elders to eat first. Plates were never heaped. Waste was almost unthinkable. Every grain of rice mattered. Farmers knew how much effort it took to grow food, and that reverence passed down through generations. To throw food away was to insult both nature and labor. Simple pleasures in a hard life. Despite the scarcity, people still found small joys in their meals. A sweetened rice cake during New Year's. A bowl of noodles shared with friends. A bit of duck fat saved from a winter feast, used to flavor a pot of greens weeks later. These moments were treasured, precisely because they were rare. Children would beg for sesame candies during market festivals. Elderly women might pass down secret recipes for dumplings, not written down, but remembered through hands and repetition. The act of preparing food, washing rice, chopping ginger, stoking the hearth, was itself a form of meditation, a shared experience that bonded generations. And for a society where words of affection were rare, a bowl of warm food offered with both hands could say everything. Feeding the many, communal cooking. In villages, cooking was often a communal affair. Neighbors might share a clay oven. Extended families lived together, so meals were cooked in large pots to feed dozens. In times of hardship, floods, famine, war, families combined resources to survive. One household might offer millet, another a handful of garlic, a third the labor to prepare it. Cooperation was a matter of survival. Even in cities, street vendors played a vital role, serving hot soup, steamed buns, or tea eggs to workers and travelers. These meals weren't extravagant, but they kept people moving, building, laboring, keeping the empire alive. What the table reveals. The dining habits of feudal China reveal more than just what people ate. They show how people lived, with discipline, with duty, with deep awareness of scarcity and gratitude. In a world where everything was earned through sweat and sacrifice, even a thin bowl of congee could carry the weight of love, respect, and resilience. Meals were not escapes from daily life. They were reflections of it, humble, ordered, and steeped in centuries of meaning. Clothing and class. What you wore was who you were. In feudal China, your clothing wasn't just what you put on each morning, it was your social identity stitched into fabric. Every thread you wore told the world who you were, where you stood, and, just as importantly, who you were not. Unlike in modern America, where fashion is a form of self-expression, in feudal China, fashion was regulation. It was hierarchy. It was law. Fabric as a social barcode. The materials alone separated people like invisible fences. Peasants wore rough hemp or rami, scratchy and durable, good for working the fields. Their clothes were often undyed, drab gray or brown, designed for function over appearance. Artisans and merchants, even if wealthier, were legally restricted in their attire, often confined to cotton or coarse cloth with limited colors. The nobility and scholar officials had the exclusive right to wear silk, a symbol of refinement, literacy, and power. These robes flowed with elegance and were dyed in vivid colors, deep blue, jade green, crimson, each shade with its own meaning. You didn't need to ask someone their rank or background. You could read it in their sleeves. The law of the robes. Clothing in feudal China was regulated by strict sumptuary laws, legal codes that dictated who could wear what based on status, gender, and occupation. These laws outlined everything from fabric types, color schemes, embroidery patterns, even sleeve length and hat shape. Violating these laws wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a crime. A peasant caught wearing silk could face steep fines or corporal punishment. Pretending to be of higher status was seen as both deception and social rebellion. It wasn't just about respect, it was about maintaining the order of the empire, one robe at a time. Uniforms of service and shame. Certain groups, especially those at the bottom of society, had their own enforced uniforms. Soldiers and laborers wore padded jackets or leather vests, marked by wear and dust. Servants and slaves often wore dark, featureless clothing that signified their obedience and invisibility. Criminals, when caught, could be forced to wear branding patches or clothing with embroidered characters announcing their crimes. You were always on display, your identity stitched plainly onto your back. Beauty, pain, and bound feet. Among noble women, especially during the Song, Ming, and Qing dynasties, beauty and class were quite literally tied to how small your feet were. This was the era of foot binding, a brutal practice that began in childhood. Young girls, usually from elite families, had their feet tightly wrapped in cloth, breaking the arch and forcing the toes under. The goal? To shape the foot into a lotus, no longer than 3 or 4 inches. A woman with bound feet couldn't run. Often, she could barely walk without assistance. And that was the point. In a culture where female virtue was tied to obedience, fragility, and domesticity, bound feet were proof that a woman belonged to a wealthy house, that she didn't need to labor in the fields. Her pain was a sign of her family's prestige. American readers might compare it to wearing a corset, but foot binding was far more permanent and irreversible. The masculine ideal, modesty and authority. For men, especially scholar officials, the ideal was not physical strength but moral strength. Robes were loose-fitting and high-collared, emphasizing modesty, intellect, and authority. Hats, too, signaled rank, especially the winged hats worn by officials, with side flaps that discouraged turning your head, and by extension, gossip or distraction. An upright appearance reflected an upright soul. Even posture mattered. To slouch was to dishonor your rank. Dress as discipline. For most people, dressing each day was not about personal style, it was a ritual of discipline and submission to a larger order. You wore what you were allowed to wear, not what you liked. The wrong color could cost you status. The wrong embroidery could cost you your freedom. Even within families, hierarchy shaped attire. A younger brother might wear shorter sleeves than his elder. A widow might be expected to wear unadorned white or pale blue for the rest of her life. Children's clothing was often simple, but respectful, meant to train them early to know their place. Exceptions and rebellions. Of course, not everyone conformed. In border regions, among ethnic minorities or during times of rebellion, people defied the dress codes, sometimes in secret, sometimes openly. Female warriors disguised themselves as men. Merchants quietly commissioned forbidden silks. Some criminals, before execution, were dressed in noble robes by sympathetic families, to grant them dignity in death, if not in life. But these were rare acts of defiance in a system that rewarded conformity and punished individualism. Clothes that kept the empire together. In feudal China, clothing was never just clothing. It was a visual system of control, an everyday performance of loyalty and hierarchy. It defined who you could speak to, marry, or work with. It even shaped how you saw yourself. When everyone looked like their station, society remained legible, predictable, stable. And in an empire that spanned mountains, rivers, and generations, that predictability was everything. A life of labor, the empire runs on backs, not wheels. In the sprawling world of feudal China, daily life was not cushioned by comfort or choice, it was driven by relentless work. From dawn until darkness, the empire ran on the sweat of the lower classes, even as their contributions were often invisible to the elite. Whether in the rice paddies or the imperial workshops, labor wasn't a part of life, it was life. For many, the day began with a bowed head and ended with an aching back. Farming, the backbone of the nation. The vast majority of China's population were farmers, and their labor fed the empire, literally and figuratively. These peasants, often tied to the land through generations, woke before the sun and returned home long after it set. They worked in rice paddies, wheat fields, tea terraces, and mulberry orchards. Their tools were simple: wooden plows, oxen, baskets, and their efforts endless. Irrigation ditches had to be cleared by hand. Crops had to be sown, tended, and harvested under threat of flood, drought, or locusts. If the harvest was poor, they starved. If it was good, they still owed taxes and grain to landlords or the imperial granary. There was no real off-season, just shifts in duties, patching roofs, tending animals, repairing roads, and honoring seasonal rituals. Farming wasn't just a job, it was a way of surviving under the weight of constant expectation. Women worked twice. Feudal China's ideals placed women behind men in the social hierarchy, but in labor, they were front and center. Rural women worked both in the fields and in the home, often with no recognition. They planted, weeded, harvested, fed animals, fetched water, wove cloth, raised children, cooked meals, and still had to bow to in-laws before bedtime. In wealthier households, they managed servants and maintained the household's internal economy, often behind the scenes. Their work was non-stop and undervalued, their fatigue worn in silence. And for those of lower status, there was no rest from labor after marriage, only more of it, done under the watchful eyes of both husband and mother-in-law. The craftsman's clock never stops. Artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, potters, carpenters, and masons formed a vital part of the empire's infrastructure. Many worked in family-run workshops, honing their trade from childhood. The work was grueling, repetitive, and sometimes dangerous, especially when dealing with fire, sharp tools, or heavy materials. Despite their skills, artisans were considered lower than farmers in Confucian hierarchy, because they didn't produce food. The irony? Their labor built temples, bridges, tools, and homes. Their craft held the material culture of the nation together. And still, they weren't allowed to wear silk or hold government office. They were praised for mastery, yet rarely rewarded with upward mobility. Merchants, rich but reviled. In today's capitalist lens, merchants might be admired for entrepreneurial spirit. In feudal China, they were viewed with suspicion, even contempt. Yes, some merchants became immensely wealthy through trade, silk, spices, ceramics, tea, but they were still seen as profiting from others' labor rather than producing something themselves. This meant that even if a merchant could afford a silk robe, they weren't legally allowed to wear it. Many used their wealth to bribe officials or marry into higher classes to escape social scorn. Others hid their status or reinvested into land, ironically becoming landlords to the very farmers considered above them. Their labor was mental and transactional, not physical, but it came at a cost: permanent outsider status in a system that prized virtue over commerce. State labor, empire building by force. When you think of the Great Wall or the Grand Canal, you might picture mighty emperors or brilliant engineers. But their true story is written in calluses, bruises, and broken bodies. Throughout China's dynastic history, the state frequently imposed forced labor on common people to build massive infrastructure projects. These weren't short gigs. They could last for years, and they were often fatal. A farmer might be pulled from his village for canal dredging far from home. A blacksmith might be drafted to forge nails or hinges for palace doors. A mason might die constructing a watchtower on a frozen mountain pass. These workers were unpaid, poorly fed, and kept under guard. Some families never saw their sons or fathers again. For the empire, these projects brought control, commerce, and legacy. For the laborers, they brought exhaustion, exile, and early death. Work as control. Beyond mere survival, labor in feudal China was also a form of state and social control. The Confucian ideal valued hard work as a moral virtue. Idleness was a sign of corruption or threat. Everyone had to be busy, at home, in the fields, in the marketplace. Even those who couldn't work, the elderly, disabled, or ill, were often made to feel like burdens. This constant activity ensured obedience. A man too tired to speak was too tired to rebel. A woman overwhelmed with chores had no time for discontent. A child raised to serve knew better than to dream. Labor kept people too occupied to question the system. Invisible efforts, monumental outcomes. So much of what we admire about ancient China, its walls, bridges, roads, gardens, palaces, and poetry, rests on the backs of people whose names we will never know. They carved the stones, carried the beams, planted the trees, and shaped the clay. They worked not for fame or legacy, but for taxes, survival, or because they were ordered to. And yet, without them, the empire would have crumbled. The books that built bureaucrats, life under the imperial exam system. In a society where most people toiled endlessly in rice paddies or over glowing forges, there was one shimmering path out, the imperial examination system. This was not a lottery, nor was it a shortcut. It was a brutal marathon of the mind, and the only real way for a commoner to climb the social ranks. Success meant power, privilege, and prestige. Failure meant returning home in shame, often to a life harder than before. An early start, childhoods devoted to books. For boys whose families dared to dream of something more, especially in the lower gentry or ambitious farming households, education began young. By age 6 or 7, a boy might be sitting cross-legged on a straw mat, chanting Confucian texts by candlelight. His first task? Memorize. Everything. Not understand. Not question. Just recite, word for word, the 4 books and 5 classics, texts attributed to Confucius and his followers. These ancient writings covered ethics, history, poetry, and political theory, but more importantly, they drilled into boys the values that underpinned imperial order, obedience, loyalty, hierarchy, and restraint. The road to advancement began not with ambition, but with rote memorization. The scholar's burden. The life of a student was mentally punishing, but not physically exempt. Most students came from modest homes. They rose early, helped with chores, and then studied for hours, often with no formal teacher, just a strict father or local tutor. There were no vacations, no weekends, no childhood. Only scrolls, ink brushes, and recitation drills. Families sacrificed enormously to support a son's education. A farmer might sell a prized ox to buy paper. A mother might go hungry so her son could pay exam fees. Whole villages pooled money to support a promising boy, hoping he'd pass and elevate their collective status. Pressure was immense, not just for the student but for everyone around him. The exam, mind game or mind trap? The exams were staged at 3 levels, local, provincial, and imperial, and each one was harder than the last. The local exams tested basic literacy and memorization. The provincial exams, held every 3 years, lasted several days and required essays, classical poetry, and knowledge of Confucian commentary. The metropolitan and palace exams, held in the capital, determined who became a scholar official, a member of the imperial bureaucracy. Testing conditions were brutal. Examinees were locked into tiny cells, roughly the size of a coffin, where they wrote with limited food, light, or sleep for up to 3 days straight. Some students collapsed from stress. A few even died. The competition was intense, hundreds of thousands applied, and fewer than 1% passed at the highest level. Success, a new life, but not without risks. To pass meant transformation. A successful candidate became a Jinxie degree holder eligible for prestigious government posts. These men wore silk, traveled with dignity, and were called master in the streets. Families celebrated with fireworks and feasts. Villages renamed gates or streets in their honor. More than just a job, passing the exam was a cultural and spiritual elevation. It proved you had virtue, not just brains. But success brought new burdens, loyalty to the emperor, scrutiny from rivals, and the expectation to govern justly. Scholar officials were caught in a constant tug-of-war between idealism and imperial politics. Failure, the quiet collapse. Most did not pass. Some failed once or twice, then gave up. Others took the exam 7, 10, even 15 times, growing old while chasing a dream that never came. Failure brought more than disappointment, it could bring humiliation. A family that had bet everything on their son might fall into poverty or lose social standing. A failed scholar had few options. He could become a low-paid village teacher, a scribe, or retreat in shame to manual labor, forever marked by his inability to make it. In a world that measured worth through text and test, to fail was to become invisible. Women shut out, but not silent. It's worth noting, this system was entirely male. Women, no matter how intelligent, were barred from official exams and government roles. Some educated women contributed poetry, ran informal salons, or even secretly tutored sons or brothers. But their potential was mostly trapped behind walls, literal and metaphorical. The exam system reinforced a patriarchal meritocracy, where merit was defined by men, for men. A system of control and continuity. While the exam system offered a sliver of mobility, it also served the state. By forcing scholars to memorize Confucian ideals, the exams produced obedient administrators, not radicals. By making success so rare and failure so common, the state ensured that even its brightest minds remained humble and hungry. This wasn't just a ladder, it was a gatekeeper, a tool of social control masquerading as opportunity. And yet, for over 1,000 years, families clung to it. Because for all its cruelty, the exam system offered something feudal China rarely did: hope. Grime and survival, hygiene and health in feudal China. In a world where one's destiny was dictated by birth and defined by duty, bodily comfort ranked low on the list of priorities. Feudal China was a civilization of immense sophistication in philosophy, governance, and art, but when it came to personal hygiene and health, life was far from pristine. If you imagine imperial palaces and ancient poetry surrounded by fragrant bathhouses and fragrant gardens, think again. For most people, cleanliness was a luxury, not a norm. The bath you didn't take. Bathing was rare, not because water was unavailable, but because time, privacy, and fuel to heat water were luxuries. Most people might wash only a few times a month. In colder regions or poor homes, even that was considered excessive. Soap, as we know it today, didn't exist. Instead, people relied on a crude substance made from animal fat and plant ash. It worked, barely. And it smelled exactly like you'd expect. For those in the working class, especially farmers and artisans, sweat and dirt were constants. After a day in the fields or at the forge, the idea of rinsing off wasn't even on the agenda. Your body was simply another tool, and tools didn't need pampering. Teeth, tools, not treasures. Dental care existed, but not in any form a modern dentist would approve of. Toothpaste didn't exist. Instead, people cleaned their teeth by rubbing them with coarse salt, charcoal powder, or ash. Bamboo or twig toothbrushes were sometimes used, but most relied on fingers. There was little understanding of plaque or cavities. Gum disease was common. Toothaches were considered normal, not alarming. If a tooth became too painful, extraction was often the only option, performed with metal tools and no anesthetic, often by someone with no formal training. Smiles were not aesthetic currency. They were functional, utilitarian, and often missing a few members. Lice, fleas, and parasites, unwanted company. In the absence of regular washing and clean bedding, parasites flourished. Lice and fleas were widespread among the lower classes, and not unheard of in the upper echelons, either. Children scratched their scalps raw. Adults developed sores from constant itching. Boiling clothes could kill some pests, but most garments were worn until they fell apart. Parasites weren't limited to the skin. With poor sanitation and limited understanding of germ theory, intestinal worms and other internal parasites were common. Stomach pain, bloating, and chronic fatigue often traced back to uninvited residents in the gut. Yet these afflictions were normalized, endured like bad weather or hunger pangs. You didn't seek treatment, you endured, because everyone else did too. The medicine of the day. Traditional Chinese medicine did offer remedies, but its effectiveness varied. Herbs, acupuncture, and cupping were used widely, some methods with genuine therapeutic value, others more symbolic. Doctors often prescribed dried animal organs, minerals, and roots, ground into powder and mixed with hot water. Snake bile, bear gallbladders, deer antlers. No creature was safe if someone believed it might bring healing. Infections, injuries, and childbirth complications could easily turn fatal. With no antibiotics and rudimentary surgery, even a minor wound might lead to sepsis. The wealthy could afford better care, more skilled physicians, rare ingredients, and healing retreats. The poor relied on folk remedies, prayers, or sheer luck. Water, life-giving, and life-threatening. Ironically, the very element associated with cleanliness was often a source of disease. Most people drank boiled water or, more commonly, tea, not for flavor, but for safety. Drinking straight from rivers or wells risked dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Boiling water became a cultural norm not from leisure, but from sheer survival instinct. Even so, outbreaks were common. In villages where waste disposal was crude and human refuse might be used as fertilizer, night soil, waterborne illness was an ever-present danger. The privilege of cleanliness. Cleanliness in feudal China was more about status than science. The imperial family and scholar officials bathed more often, partly due to better facilities, partly to differentiate themselves from uncivilized peasants. Some had access to indoor baths, attendants, and fragrant oils. Silk robes didn't touch unwashed skin. Cleanliness became a symbol of class, not a matter of health. To be clean was to be refined. To be dirty was to be laboring, disposable, poor. And so the divide between body and soul, rich and poor, played out not only in temples and courtrooms, but in the grime beneath one's fingernails. Resilience through roughness. Despite these hardships, people endured. Children played. Adults joked about their ailments. Community rituals involved herbal steams, shared foot baths, and spiritual cleansing ceremonies. Wellness wasn't absent, it was simply different, defined more by balance and endurance than sparkle and sanitation. In a way, health in feudal China wasn't just about fighting disease, it was about coexisting with discomfort, managing what you couldn't avoid, and trusting that resilience would outlast illness. This was not a sterile world. It was a sweaty, itchy, earthy existence. But it was real. And for most, it was the only world they would ever know. Brutal justice. Fear is the backbone of law in feudal China. In a world shaped by hierarchy, duty, and sacrifice, there was one more element that held society together: fear. The judicial system of feudal China was not designed to rehabilitate or reason, it was meant to control, to warn, and to punish with chilling precision. From the emperor's palatial courts to the village squares, justice was swift, public, and unforgiving. Laws carved in bamboo and blood. Legal codes in feudal China were meticulously written, updated by each dynasty, and memorized by scholar officials. Yet for the average person, these laws felt less like guidelines and more like traps. Steal a bundle of firewood? You could be beaten in the street with a bamboo rod. Argue with a tax collector? Expect to lose teeth. Minor infractions were punished harshly to instill discipline and discourage defiance. There was no such thing as a slap on the wrist. Even the innocent could suffer. Simply being accused of wrongdoing could land you in shackles. Torture as a legal tool. Modern sensibilities recoil at the word torture, but in feudal China, it was a normalized part of due process. Confessions were considered the ultimate evidence, and officials were expected to extract them, by any means necessary. Whipping with bamboo strips. Hanging suspects by their wrists. Crushing fingers with wooden frames. These weren't aberrations, they were routine steps in judicial procedure. Even scholar officials, trained in Confucian virtues, saw no contradiction. To them, truth was sacred. And if pain revealed truth, then so be it. Tattooed for life. For those who committed medium-level crimes, like fraud, repeated theft, or desertion, jail time was rare. Instead, punishments were public and permanent. A criminal might be branded or tattooed on the face, usually with characters indicating the offense: thief, traitor, liar. These marks served not just as punishment, but as a lifelong warning to others. Imagine walking through a marketplace and seeing someone's face literally spell out their shame. In feudal China, you couldn't outlive your past, it was written on your skin. Exile, punishment and displacement. Exile was another common sentence, particularly for those with political ties or high-status backgrounds. But this wasn't a vacation, it was a forced march across mountains, deserts, or swamps, usually to a remote frontier town. Exiles were stripped of wealth, family, and titles. If you survived the journey, you lived in isolation, often among foreign tribes or criminals. Some never made it. Others spent their final days as ghost-like figures, banished from everything they had ever known. For many, exile was considered a fate worse than death. Public executions, theater of terror. When crimes rose to the level of treason, murder, or rebellion, justice took center stage, literally. Public executions were not only permitted, they were encouraged. Deterrence came through display. The beheading block stood in the town square. Crowds gathered to watch. Drums beat. The condemned knelt. And the blade fell with ritual precision. But even that was merciful compared to the most feared punishment of all, lynching, or death by 1,000 cuts. In this horror, the body was slowly sliced apart, limb by limb, flesh by flesh, while the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. It was less about punishment, more about erasing a soul from memory itself. Families of the accused were often forced to watch. Guilt by association. In many cases, justice didn't stop at the individual. If someone was accused of treason, their entire family, sometimes their entire village, could be punished. Wives, children, cousins, even neighbors were arrested, questioned, tortured. Properties were seized. Names were blacklisted. This practice of collective punishment ensured that even the thought of rebellion died quickly. Everyone policed each other. Silence became dangerous. Loyalty was survival. Law as a weapon of the powerful. While the law was harsh for commoners, it was also uneven. Rich merchants might buy off an investigator. A scholar official's son might escape with a fine. But a starving farmer who stole rice could lose a hand, or a head. Corruption was embedded in the system. Officials were supposed to be models of virtue, but many abused their power to settle scores or build influence. Justice depended not just on law, but on relationships, bribes, and fear. And yet, people endured. Some believed that harsh laws kept society in order. Others simply had no choice but to obey order by oppression. Feudal China's legal system wasn't designed to promote freedom or reform. It was designed to maintain stability at all costs. And in some sense, it worked. Despite the cruelty, despite the blood, dynasties lasted for centuries. The streets were mostly quiet. People knew their place. Justice wasn't blind, it was weaponized. It didn't ask why, it declared how. And in doing so, it shaped an empire that feared chaos more than cruelty. Everyone was watching, life under the all-seeing eye. In feudal China, the concept of privacy as we know it today simply didn't exist. The fabric of society was woven tightly with eyes everywhere, watching, listening, and reporting. Whether in a small village or the vast imperial palace, your every move could be observed, and often was. Surveillance at the village level. In rural villages, where most people lived, social order was maintained not only by law but by a complex web of community surveillance. The village chief, often appointed by local magistrates, functioned like a watchful guardian, and sometimes a feared informant. Neighbors didn't just exchange pleasantries, they were expected to be alert to any suspicious behavior. A stranger passing through, a whispered rumor, or a late-night gathering could all raise alarms. People understood that their survival often depended on being seen as loyal and trustworthy. Reporting suspicion, a duty and a risk. It was not merely encouraged but considered a civic duty to report anything suspicious to authorities. Failure to do so could implicate you as complicit or disloyal. Informers were everywhere, and the boundary between genuine concern and opportunism was thin. For many, this created an atmosphere thick with mistrust and paranoia. Friendships were fragile, and alliances could shift overnight. The social fabric was as much about watching others as it was about being watched yourself. Informants and secret police. The government took surveillance to a new level. Spies, informants, and secret police were embedded within communities, marketplaces, and even households. These agents gathered intelligence on potential rebels, dissidents, or anyone who might disrupt the status quo. The secret police reported directly to local magistrates or, in more sensitive cases, to imperial officials. Their presence was often invisible yet deeply felt. Knowing that any word or gesture could be overheard or reported instilled a culture of silence and self-censorship. The palace, a fortress of suspicion. If life among the common people was marked by vigilance, the imperial palace was a pressure cooker of constant surveillance and intrigue. Within the forbidding walls of the Forbidden City, trust was a dangerous luxury. Eunuchs, court officials, and concubines all acted as eyes and ears for the emperor or rival factions. No one was truly safe from suspicion. The emperor's safety depended on knowing every secret and betrayal before it happened. To achieve this, a vast network of informers operated inside the palace, creating an environment where every smile might mask a hidden agenda. Consequences of being watched. This ever-present gaze affected daily life profoundly. People adjusted their behavior constantly, careful not to say too much or act too freely. Conversations were guarded. Even within families, what was spoken aloud could be carefully measured. Public displays of emotion or dissent were dangerous. In such a world, individual freedom was sacrificed for collective order. The cost was high, suspicion eroded trust, and the pressure to conform was relentless. The psychological toll. Living under constant surveillance bred anxiety and fear. People learned to police themselves, knowing the eyes of neighbors and officials could be anywhere. Some became cynical, others withdrew. Many accepted the loss of privacy as a necessary sacrifice to maintain peace and stability. Yet beneath this acceptance lay a quiet undercurrent of resistance and resentment, seeds that would, in later centuries, contribute to social upheaval. Legacy of surveillance. The all-seeing eye of feudal China left a complex legacy. While it maintained social order for centuries, it also stifled creativity, freedom, and trust. For the modern reader, it's a stark reminder of the costs of authoritarian control and the fragility of privacy. Marriage and obligation, a bond beyond love. In feudal China, marriage was not the romantic union many envision today. It was a strategic alliance, a transaction carefully orchestrated by parents to uphold family honor, secure economic stability, and maintain social standing. Arranged matches, duty over desire. From a young age, boys and girls were groomed not just to obey their elders but to fulfill predetermined roles, especially when it came to marriage. Parents selected partners based on family background, reputation, and dowries, the wealth or property the bride's family would bring into the marriage. Love, personal preference, or emotional compatibility were secondary considerations, if considered at all. Astrologers were often consulted to ensure the couple's birth dates were compatible, reflecting the importance of harmony not just between two people but between two families and their fortunes. The bride's new world. Once married, a woman left her birth family to live with her husband's household, often a multi-generational family with strict hierarchies. Her role was clear: to serve her husband, his parents, and manage the household. Respect and obedience were expected, sometimes enforced by tradition and sometimes by rigid social pressure. Women's identities became tied to their duties as daughters-in-law, mothers, and caretakers, rather than individuals with personal ambitions. Polygamy and concubines. While women were expected to be loyal and devoted, their husbands often had more freedom. It was common for wealthy men, especially officials and landowners, to have concubines in addition to their primary wife. Concubines held a lower social status, and their children were usually considered less legitimate, but they served important roles, providing heirs and sometimes political alliances. This system reflected the patriarchal nature of society, reinforcing male dominance and the control men held over family and property. Divorce, a rare and stigmatized option. Unlike today, divorce in feudal China was extremely rare and heavily stigmatized. Once married, couples were expected to stay together for life, regardless of personal happiness or abuse. For women especially, divorce meant social ruin and economic hardship. A divorced woman often had nowhere to return and little support. Only under the most extreme circumstances, such as proven infidelity or failure to produce a male heir, might a divorce be considered, and even then, it required family approval and legal procedures. Marriage is a social contract. Marriage was less about two individuals and more about bonding families and preserving social order. Dowries and bride prices were part of complex negotiations reflecting wealth and status. Marriages could cement political alliances or resolve family disputes. Women's personal desires were secondary to the family's interests, and breaking a marriage contract was often seen as a threat to the wider community's stability. The weight of obligation. For both men and women, marriage was the start of a lifelong commitment, not just to a spouse but to a network of duties, expectations, and social roles. The pressure to produce male heirs was immense, as sons carried on family names and inherited property. Women's lives were often confined to the household, and their value was measured by obedience and motherhood. Men balanced their roles as heads of households with responsibilities to their families and the state. Reflections on marriage in feudal China. This system ensured continuity and order in a society where personal freedom was limited, but it also meant many lived without the choice or voice we associate with love and partnership today. Marriage, in this context, was a pillar of feudal society, a contract binding families, reinforcing hierarchies, and sustaining traditions that endured for centuries. Rebellion and repression, the price of defiance. Despite the strict order and heavy surveillance that gripped feudal China, unrest simmered beneath the surface. Peasant uprisings erupted repeatedly, born out of desperation, injustice, and unbearable hardship. But these rebellions were met with a swift and brutal hand, showing the lengths to which the imperial government would go to maintain control. The roots of revolt. Life for peasants was harsh. Heavy taxes, forced labor on state projects like canals and walls, poor harvests, and corrupt local officials all contributed to widespread suffering. When survival itself became a daily struggle, the bonds that held society together began to fray. Outbursts of anger turned into organized revolts, as peasants tried to resist oppression and demand relief. Though rebellion was dangerous, the hope for a better life fueled these desperate acts. Government's ruthless response. The imperial government had little tolerance for dissent. Once a rebellion flared, authorities acted quickly and decisively to stamp it out. Military forces were deployed with orders to crush uprisings brutally. No mercy was shown to those who dared defy the emperor's rule. Collective punishment. Families and villages pay the price. What made the repression particularly cruel was the practice of collective punishment. If even one person in a family or village was involved in rebellion, entire households or communities could be punished, often with execution, exile, or confiscation of property. This policy aimed to deter others by making rebellion a risk not just for the individual, but for their entire social network. Public executions and fear as tools of control. Executions were often public and brutal, designed to instill fear and demonstrate the consequences of defiance. The infamous death by 1,000 cuts was one of many horrific punishments used to deter rebellion and enforce loyalty. The cycle of violence and resistance. Repression only deepened resentment among the oppressed. Some peasants returned to rebellion despite the risks, creating a vicious cycle of uprising and crackdown. This tension contributed to the slow erosion of the feudal system over centuries, as pressures for change built beneath the surface. Legacy of rebellion and repression. These uprisings and their harsh suppression paint a picture of a society struggling to maintain order at any cost. The state's willingness to punish entire communities highlights the brutal nature of power during this era. For modern readers, it's a sobering reflection on the human cost of authoritarian rule, and the resilience of those who resist. Inside the Forbidden City, where power was a dangerous game. While the fields of rural China were filled with the sweat and struggle of peasants, the capital pulsed with a different kind of tension, one woven from silks, secrets, and strategy. Behind the high red walls of Beijing's Forbidden City, the seat of the emperor's power, life was anything but peaceful. This was the domain not only of the Son of Heaven but of countless others who orbited his throne, ministers, eunuchs, concubines, and imperial relatives. And unlike the straightforward suffering of the countryside, the palace was a web of rivalries, betrayal, and political survival. The wrong whisper, glance, or gesture could mean ruin or death. A palace built on appearances. On the surface, court life appeared serene and ceremonial. Elegant halls echoed with the soft rustle of silk robes. Marble bridges spanned carefully crafted waterways. Gold and jade shimmered under sunlight streaming through ornate wooden screens. Rituals and etiquette dictated every movement. But beneath the elegance lay tension sharper than any blade. Every official had an agenda. Every smile might conceal a threat. The emperor, surrounded, yet isolated. Although the emperor sat at the pinnacle of power, he was often isolated within his own court. Surrounded by flattery, misinformation, and manipulation, emperors were both revered and deceived. The inner court, dominated by eunuchs, castrated men entrusted with managing palace affairs, often controlled access to the emperor. Over time, some eunuchs gained immense power, acting as gatekeepers and puppet masters. Ministers from the outer court resented them, creating deep rivalries. The emperor had to walk a razor's edge between trusting his advisors and avoiding manipulation. A single misjudgment could destabilize the realm, or cost him his life. Concubines and the battle for influence. The emperor's harem was another battlefield. Imperial concubines lived in splendid isolation, yet were deeply involved in the politics of succession and court alliances. Bearing the emperor's son could elevate a woman from obscurity to power, but that path was fraught with competition, sabotage, and lethal gossip. Jealousy among consorts sometimes erupted in poisonings, framed scandals, or mysterious deaths. The lives of these women were luxurious yet perilous, caught in a game where beauty and cunning determined fate. The scholars and ministers, virtue and politics collide. Outside the palace walls, scholar officials, many of whom had passed the grueling imperial exams, saw themselves as guardians of morality and order. But inside the court, even the most upright minister could be dragged into palace intrigue. False accusations, secret alliances, or political purges could destroy careers overnight. Those who dared challenge corrupt eunuchs or royal relatives often met with imprisonment or execution, all under the guise of preserving harmony. Ironically, those who tried to remain morally pure sometimes became victims of the very system they sought to uphold. Silence and survival. In the Forbidden City, silence was a virtue. Speaking too boldly, showing ambition, or even aligning too closely with the wrong faction could spell doom. Many officials survived by keeping their heads down, watching, listening, and waiting. Trust was a rare and dangerous luxury. Spies lurked among servants, eunuchs, and even concubines. Letters were intercepted. Conversations were overheard. A courtier could never be sure who might report their words, or distort them. Ceremony as control. The endless rituals and formalities weren't just for show. They served a powerful purpose, to keep everyone focused on tradition, hierarchy, and appearances, distracting them from power plays happening in the shadows. Even the smallest ceremonies had layers of symbolism: where to stand, how to bow, what colors to wear. Breaking with protocol was seen not only as disrespect, but as potential rebellion. A beautiful gauge. Life in the Forbidden City was both a dream and a prison. The walls were high, the roofs gilded, the courtyard serene. But everyone inside was trapped in a system where loyalty meant surveillance, where luxury hid danger, and where ambition could be fatal. Some dreamed of escape. Others plotted their ascent. Many simply tried to survive. The palace was more than a seat of power. It was a stage for human drama, where every act was watched, judged, and often punished. In the end, the Forbidden City wasn't just the emperor's domain, it was a mirror of the entire feudal system, hierarchical, rigid, and merciless to the unprepared. You were not a person, you were a role. In feudal China, identity wasn't something you crafted. It wasn't about dreams, ambitions, or self-expression. It was assigned to you, by your birth, your gender, your class, and your family's status. Personal desires didn't matter. The system did. If you were born the son of a farmer, you would die a farmer. If you were a daughter, your future belonged to the husband your parents chose for you. You weren't raised to ask, "What do I want?" You were taught to ask, "What does my family, my society, or my emperor need me to be?" The state's human inventory. From the imperial court down to the smallest village, people weren't seen as individuals. They were resources, units of labor, tax revenue, and military strength. Bureaucrats kept meticulous population records, not to celebrate the diversity of their people, but to ensure maximum efficiency and control. A village wasn't a place of community, it was a ledger entry in a tax book. A child wasn't a bundle of potential, they were a future contributor to the state machine. Human lives were data, calculated and controlled. No room for selfhood. The concept of the self as we understand it today, independent, expressive, deserving of autonomy, didn't exist in the Confucian order. You were expected to mold yourself into the perfect role, the obedient son, the virtuous wife, the loyal official, the hard-working farmer. Deviation from these norms wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. To express individuality in dress, speech, or ambition could invite punishment. Society thrived on predictability and conformity, not creativity or rebellion. Freedom was submission. What Americans might consider freedom, the right to pursue happiness, express opinions, or make personal choices, was practically incomprehensible in this world. The highest form of honor was not forging your own path but perfectly fulfilling your assigned one. Confucian ideals placed harmony above all else. And harmony came from knowing your place and staying in it. A good life wasn't one where you achieved your personal goals, it was one where you performed your role without complaint. Voices unheard, dreams unspoken. There were no journals of dissent. No love poems between social classes. No memoirs of a peasant who chose a different life. If people imagined more for themselves, they rarely said it aloud, and they certainly never acted on it. For women, the boundaries were even narrower. A wife who wanted to learn, travel, or lead would be met with ridicule or worse. Her virtue lay in obedience, silence, and service. Even her face was often hidden from public view. Children were extensions of their fathers. Their thoughts didn't matter unless they were loyal. Their futures were predetermined. A boy might dream of becoming a scholar, but unless his family had the means to fund his study, that dream was stillborn. A machine with no exit. The structure of feudal society was self-reinforcing. To question it was to question order itself. People who pushed against their roles were often seen not as visionaries, but as threats, enemies of harmony. Those who rose, such as through the imperial exams, did so not by rejecting the system, but by mastering its rules to perfection. Even success was a form of submission. This didn't mean people were robots. They loved, feared, laughed, and mourned. But those emotions were kept within the boundaries set by ritual and hierarchy. To be fully human, to think freely, choose freely, and live freely, was not part of the design. A system that outlived the soul. Over generations, this ideology became so deeply ingrained that it stopped feeling like oppression. It became culture. People didn't just submit, they believed. This is what made the system so powerful. It didn't need chains or prisons to control people, it only needed expectations. And so, a child in a village would look at the stars and wonder, but only for a moment. Then he'd get back to work. Wondering wasn't his role. His role was to farm. Or to serve. Or to die in war if called. The unseen cost. To a modern American, this may feel unbearable. The idea of being denied agency, voice, or identity cuts against everything we value. And yet, for centuries, this was normal for millions. What did humanity lose in that system? What inventions weren't dreamed? What revolutions of thought never took root? What stories were never told? We may never know. The archives of feudal China are full of numbers, titles, and edicts, but rarely of hearts. The individual was erased, their uniqueness flattened under the weight of duty and obedience. Legacy of a silenced majority. Today, China's past is often remembered for its grandeur, great walls, intricate art, profound philosophy. But beneath the brushstrokes and bricks lies a quieter story, a civilization that thrived by silencing most of its people. Not through hatred, but through ritual. Not through violence alone, but through social design. As we admire the scale of its achievements, we must also remember the cost. The millions who were never allowed to be more than a role in someone else's empire. A legacy of contradiction, greatness at a price. Feudal China was a paradox, a civilization that dazzled the world with brilliance while binding millions in systems of obedience and silence. It built wonders and made breathtaking advancements in science, art, and philosophy. Yet it did so within a structure that offered very little personal freedom, brutal social rigidity, and unforgiving justice. Looking back, it's clear. The same system that gave us some of humanity's greatest innovations also silenced countless voices in the process. The genius within the cage. China's contributions to world history are astounding. Gunpowder changed warfare forever. The compass reoriented navigation. Paper revolutionized knowledge sharing. The printing press emerged centuries before Gutenberg's. The Great Wall, stretching over 13,000 miles, remains a jaw-dropping symbol of collective effort and state power. These achievements didn't emerge from chaos, they were the product of a civilization that valued order, discipline, and central control. Scholars studied rigorously. Artisans trained for decades. State resources were organized with precision. Even commoners, through sheer labor, built cities, canals, and palaces that still stand today. And yet, for every scholar who passed the imperial exam, thousands failed. For every craftsman who left behind a legacy, countless more died unknown. The system didn't aim to nurture individual greatness, it demanded conformity and punished deviation. Innovation without liberation. That's the contradiction. China was advanced in many ways, but not in how it treated its people. Most innovations weren't born from freedom, but from necessity or imperial demand. A better plow meant more taxes. A faster way to print meant more propaganda. The genius of China's inventors often served the state, not the self. This distinction is crucial. In a society where ideas flowed upward only when approved, and talent had to align with the state's goals, the full spectrum of human creativity was never realized. Potential was filtered. Lives were directed, not lived. A society of bound possibility. From birth, your path was largely predetermined. Were you born into a farming family? You'd work the land your entire life. Were you a woman? You'd serve a husband and his family, your worth tied to dowries and obedience. Were you poor? You had almost no chance to rise, unless, against the odds, you became one of the few to pass the grueling imperial exam. This rigidity created a powerful machine, but also a fragile human landscape, where aspirations were buried and human stories flattened. Glory at a human cost. Even China's most celebrated accomplishments came at staggering human cost. The Great Wall, for example, wasn't just a symbol of protection, it was a graveyard of forced laborers. Tens of thousands died constructing it. Their names were never recorded. Their sacrifices were never honored. They were expendable, replaceable parts of the emperor's vision. It was the same with massive canal systems, palaces, temples, and armies. Each required immense human labor, often coerced. Every brick laid in splendor had the weight of human suffering behind it. Control over compassion. Feudal China valued stability above all. That meant controlling the population with laws, surveillance, and brutal consequences. Questioning authority, whether as a peasant, a scholar, or even a court official, could mean exile, torture, or death. Families were punished for the actions of individuals. Public executions weren't just punishments, they were lessons for everyone else. Compassion, when it existed, was often private. Public life demanded allegiance. The state expected devotion, not empathy. A culture that endured, a structure that fell. Despite its many flaws, the legacy of this era still shapes modern China, and the world. Confucian respect for elders and education remains. So do the engineering marvels, literary classics, and philosophical insights. The values of hard work, discipline, and duty echo across centuries. But the hierarchical structure, the crushing social immobility, the state-first mentality, they did not last. In time, rebellion, foreign invasion, and internal collapse would challenge the system. Dynasties fell. The people eventually demanded more. Looking back with clarity, to understand feudal China is to hold two truths at once. It was brilliant, a culture of deep thought, technological achievement, and artistic beauty. It was oppressive, a machine built on the labor, silence, and suffering of millions. It's tempting to romanticize the robes, the temples, the wisdom of sages. But we must also remember the blood, the hunger, and the loneliness of those who never had the freedom to speak, love, or dream. The grandeur was real. So was the grief. What it means for us today. For an American reader, where individual rights and personal freedom are considered sacred, this history may feel both foreign and chilling. It reminds us that human progress doesn't just depend on intelligence or innovation, it depends on freedom. When people can speak, experiment, fail, and express without fear, that's when true greatness emerges. China's story is not just a chronicle of what was, it's a warning of what happens when the state grows too powerful, and the individual too small. As we celebrate the wisdom of the past, we must also commit to protecting the freedoms that allow such wisdom to grow. Final reflections, a civilization of light and shadow. In the end, feudal China stood as one of history's grand paradoxes, a land of towering achievements and devastating inequality. Its culture produced enduring wisdom, breathtaking art, and revolutionary innovations that continue to influence the modern world. From the compass to the printing press, from Confucian philosophy to monumental architecture, its legacy is undeniable. Yet all this brilliance came at a steep cost. For the vast majority, peasants, women, servants, and the voiceless, the price of maintaining this grandeur was submission, suffering, and silence. Individual freedom was sacrificed for social harmony. Dissent was punished. The system uplifted a few and crushed the many. It's easy to marvel at the beauty of porcelain, the elegance of calligraphy, and the precision of imperial bureaucracy. But behind those wonders were hands that toiled without choice, minds that were never allowed to speak freely, and lives that unfolded not by will, but by decree. Feudal China was not just a time and place, it was a system, both magnificent and merciless. To remember it honestly is to admire its achievements without forgetting the people it cost. Feudal China was a world of breathtaking beauty, and heartbreaking brutality. Behind every invention and tradition were real people, living under rules they didn't choose, paying prices we can hardly imagine. If this glimpse into the past made you think, made you feel, or opened your eyes to a world you never knew, there's so much more to explore. So if you're into true stories, untold histories, and the hidden lives behind ancient empires, hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and join me, Thunga, for more stories that bring the past roaring to life. This is story time, where every tale has a heartbeat. See you in the next chapter.